I think we're good. I think we're good.
Okay,
So,
cool. Let me.
anybody who might be watching at this very early minute of the stream, um, we are live again. This is episode number 4. We've been away for ages due to all sorts of reasons, but we're gonna try and do this again on a regular basis. And we're joined by Max. So what I would like to do is just point everybody down to the description. The description has all the links for my channel, for Max's channel, for Max's music, for my pedals, for all these kind of things, how to support the channel and all that sort of stuff. And to begin this new, dare I say, revamping of the live shows, we have got the first the first topic being what is vintage, or what does it really mean, and we've got a few things underneath that. So the reason this came up was we were thinking of some topics for the future, and a lot of it has to do with gear, obviously, because that's what we like to tinker with. And actually, these topics for today were actually Max's idea. So while I do some promo, I'm gonna hand you over to Max. The reason I'm doing this is because you came up with this question: what is vintage, right? And I'll be honest with you. You don't want to know my answer to what I think is vintage, so I'm gonna let you go.
Well, you set it up now. I'm definitely going to be pushing you for your full answer on that one.
Yeah,
Um,
it'll come. It'll come. So while you do that, I'm gonna quickly post some links, and
cool.
get the
Okay,
stream.
so
Go for it.
yeah. So vintage is, so first of all, I mean, I think most of us will probably, when we think about vintage gear, I think the kind of thing we'd be thinking about would be things like, a 1959 Les Paul, or an old Fender Tweed amp from the 50s, that kind of thing. I think in broad terms, I think we can talk about vintage as being, guitars and amplifiers. And I'll come back to why it's only guitars and amplifiers from the mid 20th century. And that's really kind of what people view as like the golden age of guitar instrument manufacturing. I think probably because it was really the beginning of electric guitar manufacturing. And as we all know, electric guitars have been massively influential on the way people have made music for the past 70 years. Um, but also because the guitars and amplifiers that were made in the 50s and the 60s, and to a certain extent the 70s, are these days viewed with a kind of magical mystique. I mean, when you talk about a 1959 Les Paul, that's one of the most expensive guitars, a real one, I mean, one of the most expensive guitars you could buy. They get into, over sort of mid six figures in terms of their prices. Some of them, if they're celebrity owned, I mean, for instance, if you look at the one that's known as the Greenie, which was owned by Peter Green, was owned by um, a man from Thin Lizzy.
Oh yeah, yeah.
um, and obviously is now owned by Kirk Hammett. I think if that were to go on sale these days, I think you probably wouldn't get much change from $1 million. So that obviously there's that implication too, but generally, broadly, the word vintage means old and good, I think, in most people's minds. And I think that's kind of the crux of what we're getting at here, is that something that, has got some age to it, that comes from a period where generally those things were really, really well made, and is now viewed as being very special. I think that's kind of the way most people think of vintage gear. I'd apply that to guitars and amplifiers only because, so guitars is kind of an obvious one. A well-maintained guitar can last 100 years. There are guitars around now that are usable that have been around for over 100 years. Electric guitars, well maintained, that are made now, there's no reason that they couldn't be still around and usable in 200 years, you know, because you can get that out of wood and metal and plastic. With amplifiers, there's a bit more to it, obviously, you know, sort of because we're dealing with electronics. And I probably have to defer to you in terms of speaking about electronics, but my layman's understanding of electronics is that, you know, that certain components have more durability than others. So if you have an amplifier from the 1950s that is still in use, there's a good chance that a substantial amount of it will have been replaced, upgraded, that kind of thing. But generally, there are still a lot of people out there using amps from the 50s and 60s. So that's really it. That's kind of, I guess that's how I think of vintage instruments. Now, there is also kind of a much looser definition of vintage, where I once heard someone talk about it as being like anything that's over 25 years old and is of reasonable quality. I think that's a much broader definition, because then you're getting into, like, you know, guitars from like the early 90s. You know, is a 1992 Les Paul Standard a vintage instrument if it's, you know, a good one and in good condition? That's you know, I don't know what the answer to that is, but I guess, you know, is it a matter of opinion? Is it something that can be defined? Who knows?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that I always wonder, one of the main things I always think about is how there are two opposing things. One is that modern manufacturing processes have made high quality things a lot easier to achieve.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, there is a certain amount of personal care towards building something that might have been lost at the same time. When it comes to, dare I say, the places that build things, but also the people that build things, because we've become a little bit of a throwaway society, and a society which likes to just buy, you know, and
Yeah.
because it kind of like everything works together, stuff becomes cheaper, more accessible. People's wages, or kind of not anymore, but people's wages used to go up.
Yeah.
And so it was easier to buy stuff, etc., etc. So it was this kind of cycle. So on the one hand, I would say that a lot of things that are built well nowadays are probably better than they were built in the past. And on the other hand, it's probably much easier to get things that are just quickly, you know, mass produced, with flaws in it as well. Because, you know, I think about it this way: like, you buy something. Let's say you buy a cheap guitar pedal, a Behringer or a Donner or something, and you buy it for 20 quid off Amazon, and it comes and it kind of works, and then it stops working after a week. What are the chances that you're going to actually send it back and complain and make a fuss for that 20 bucks? You'll probably just buy another one. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's,
totally.
On the one hand, I've got, like, I don't really care much about vintage stuff, because I feel like, you know, why would I want to buy something old? And on the other hand, we've also lost that kind of idea, like, okay, this is something that I spent time and money to get. Now I'm going to look after it, and I'm also going to make sure that it's fit for purpose and it's going to last, and all that stuff. So the other thing, from a more kind of like, how would I put it, like a soundbite kind of idea. My first thought to that question, what is vintage anyway, was like nostalgia, you know.
Yes.
Just nostalgia, just pure nostalgia. And there's nothing wrong with nostalgia, but nostalgia is nostalgia. And therefore, does it really have a place? Well, I mean, you go and you look at. So I was in Texas, and I went to this guitar fair in Dallas, and the amount of vintage guitars that were there that people fawned over, and the prices on it shows you that there's obviously a certain love for this stuff.
Yeah.
However, once you get over a certain bracket, it's not really a case of they're not really buying it to play them. They are buying it
Yeah,
to
they're like the
have.
20 grand plus stuff that they hope will go up in value, right?
Yeah, and I've got a suspicion that a lot of it has to do with like any collector. We're talking about music gear, and we're talking about guitars and amps and stuff like that. But there's people who
Yeah.
like old cars. There's people who like all sorts of stuff that are old, and it's more, in my opinion, probably more a hobby collector kind of thing. I doubt somebody's going to buy Jimmy Page's Strat and then take it out on the road gigging every night. So
Well, I mean, I agree with I agree with most of what you've just said there. I think the last thing though, I mean you're aware of like rig rundowns that Premier Guitar does. They're all over YouTube.
yeah, I
I
love
think a
them.
lot of the sorry, go on.
I love them. I have to watch every one of them.
Yeah, but so I think the ones that I really like is I mean you take the ones like Dan Auerbach for instance, right? From the Black Keys. And I think they're probably the latest one. It's like he's got all of his weird and wonderful guitars. I found this in a pawn shop. I found this for $600. We worked on it for a year to make it actually play, all that kind of stuff. And then right at the end, he whips out like a 59 burst, right? And it's like he's going out touring with that. And it is assuming it's a legitimate 59 burst. That's a $250,000 guitar. He is touring with it. I know that's obviously that's Dan Auerbach kind of thing, but I think the rig rundowns probably demonstrate to a certain extent that some people at least are kind of not everyone who has been professionals like high level professionals are still kind of taking these things out. But that being said, also a lot of them are taking out like custom shop recreations of those things instead of the real thing.
Yeah, yeah. I can't
Like sorry, go on.
I can't remember which one I was watching, and it wasn't long ago, and they were actually explaining how they got this vintage guitar, and then they literally had a custom shop copy every single detail and measurement. So that's probably so down the line that the person is trying to protect his investment. At some point, that thing's not going to go on the road anymore. I don't know. I suppose from a parts point of view, though, if you end up with a vintage amp, chances that for it to run properly, that you're gonna have to replace all the caps, and obviously the
Yeah.
tubes are pretty good. And so there's obviously at some point there's gonna be a problem with how up to spec is it from a authenticity point of view. Kind of like people who refurbish cars and stuff. At some point,
Yeah.
certain parts just have to be replaced.
So how much of it is actually a vintage car and how much of it is just new stuff
Yeah, I mean,
onto it?
to
It's Trigger's broom, isn't it? I don't know if you know that reference,
it
but
is
it's
also
like,
it's nitpicking, to be fair. I mean,
yeah.
it really
Well,
is.
well, this is it because it's like it is about aesthetics ultimately. When you talk about, you mentioned nostalgia, and I think of nostalgia as being like primarily an aesthetic consideration because it's not really based on actual realities. People aren't thinking back to an actual time. They're thinking back to kind of a construct that they imagine in their heads of the way things were, the way things looked and felt and sounded and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
And because we're talking about music, I think obviously music is primarily about aesthetics. So I think it's like, so when you see like, Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers playing, mainly you know, vintage Strats, vintage Gibsons, vintage, you know, vintage gear generally. I think a lot of that kind of ties into probably, you know, probably an idea of nostalgia because they kind of represent like a certain kind of American band, and that's kind of part of their image, isn't it? That they're kind of the instruments that they're playing are like they represent that kind of the pinnacle of American instrument manufacturing, you know.
Do you the one thing that I was kind of like toying in my head, like we asked the question, what is vintage? And I think it's, yeah, to me it's not as obvious, but there are obvious kind of little points to say, well, okay, it's something old, um, it's something that was built in a specific way, um, but so I'm trying to lead into the next kind of part of this, which was um, why people are obsessed with it. Now, the word obsessed is probably a good word to use. And, you know, if we just said, okay, well, you know, why do people like vintage stuff? Why do they buy it? Is not the same as saying why are people obsessed with it. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. Yeah. I think the upset. I mean, the thing is, like, you know, I know a lot of people who are totally like into vintage gear and think about want to own vintage gear. They just can't afford it, you know. So and even if they could, they might. That's not the gear they would necessarily buy because they still need to own gear that works and that they can insure and then they can take out and play and all that kind of stuff. So um, yeah, I think the interest in vintage gear is distinct from people who collect it or people who consider it to be an investment. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
that's I do like the word obsession because obsession implies that it's not necessarily a rational thing.
Or healthy.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. To like something purely because it's old. I mean, you know, a new Strat looks more or less like a 1964 Strat.
Yeah.
So why do you prefer the 64 one? You know, if it's a really pristine 1964, then why do you want to have that one instead of the custom shop Strat, which while being expensive is still, you know, 10, 20 times cheaper? You know, it's an interesting question.
Well, because I think that's where lines blur between the kind of love for older things and the nostalgia behind it, and maybe the bands that you look back on that you loved, they used that stuff um, in combination with this idea that it has a certain sound that it's going to give you, which,
Talking of sound, so I wanted to ask you this because you're going to know this a lot better than me. How to what extent? Because when I was talking in the intro about like what you know what is vintage gear, you know, the reason I said specifically like guitars and amps is because I'm not aware of people thinking of like vintage pedals as being like necessarily as desirable. Part of me thinks that that's because everyone kind of feels like you know, a pedal from the 60s is definitely not going to work, you know, because it's definitely going to be broken and I can't fix it and it's going to be massively expensive and I won't be able to use it. So I should just, if I want to get that sound. So what are your thoughts on like vintage pedals?
well, I think the problem with pedals is that, or with amps and pedals will suffer from the same problem, and that is that the, you know, old caps go, they start leaking, they do all sorts of weird things, and so over time they might have to be replaced. And if you're lucky, you never have to.
Mm.
But the chances are probably better than not. But nowadays, what people do in the pedal world is that they buy what they call new old stock. So there's these companies that will make the old components, especially like capacitors and stuff like that, like they did in the old days.
Yeah.
And so when you buy from somebody who's building kind of especially if they are recreating fuzz faces and tone benders and all these kind of gear, and they want to try and get to the same sound that the thing came out with when it was built in 1971 or something, then they
Yeah.
will buy the new old stock. So basically the parts that are made the same way as they used to, usually just better, so they will probably last a bit longer, etc. But you know, when it comes to parts and stuff, you never know. You just never know. You have to buy quality,
Yeah.
and you've got to pay some good money, and then you're probably going to be all right. But I mean, amps have the same issues, and then there's a lot of valves, the way they were made and the way they're made now, and how few companies are left making them. So the choices, from a manufacturer's point of view, what you can get.
Yeah.
So I don't
So I
think
think
you can really like. Well, actually, there's two things. So, you can probably get roughly in the ballpark, but then again, you'll never know what that thing sounded like in 1971 with a
yeah.
guitar built in 1971, with an amp and a speaker built in 1971. So
Yeah.
there wouldn't be a comparison. Part of the appeal, from what I think, especially when it comes to the old fuzzes, because that's really what we're talking about when we talk about vintage stuff, is that there is actually a certain sound that people like because of parts failing, because of leaky
Yes.
capacitors, because of the not enough juice coming through to the transistors. I mean, you know it yourself. Don't put a brand new 9-volt battery in your pedal. Put a shitty
Yeah.
one that's half dead. And it's going to
Yeah. So
sound ten
yeah,
times
that
better.
kind of yeah.
And it's
That
that kind of
sag, that
thing.
kind of Velcro.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can recreate that in seconds with just a bias on the power, right? I mean, seriously.
Yeah, I on my power supply on my pedal board, I think two of the outputs actually have little dials where you can turn it down so you get less power to if you're powering a fuzz.
Exactly, exactly. So I don't personally. I kind of don't really. Well, I'm gonna rephrase that. I personally wouldn't go down that route to try and get something old so that it can sound old. I'm more than happy to use modern methods to get the same result if I am after that said result.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But here's another
So
thing. I think that it has a huge amount to do with the kind of music that you're into and that you actually want to do. I mean, I never thought that I would be interested in um, cranky fuzzes that sound like they're not working properly until a year ago, because it was just not the kind of thing I was interested in. But since we're kind of messing with some more doomy kind of stuff and more different sounds, you suddenly start, thinking, well, how can I get that? So, for
yeah.
example, if somebody, plays thrash, he has there's no reason for him to look at old amps, old pedals, old anything.
Well, I was thinking about that because it's like I think in a way it's a shame. I mean, part of the I've kind of been running into this lately because with my band we play a sort of a I guess what you'd describe as a fairly modern kind of heavy metal. And I think that what we've been doing for the past year is driving towards setups that kind of really follow that kind of direction where we have, very modern sounding amps and our guitars have very modern appointments. And everything's kind of driving towards being quite sort of that sort of technical precision. There's not any variation. It's exactly what you want, and it's kind of clinical. And what I'm actually finding is the more we drive towards that, the less I don't know. You don't there's no longer any kind of surprise to the sound. I think some people are into that.
Mm.
When you talk about bands like Periphery or whatever, that's a band who want their equipment to do like very precisely exactly this one kind of thing. And that to me is diametrically opposed to those kind of much more feel-based bands like the Black Keys, for instance, who actually go after the kind of the unexpected, the surprise, the kind of the feel-based thing where it changes from night to night. And I think in a way it's like it's almost a shame that, you know, there's this kind of assumption that if you play this kind of modern kind of metal sound, that you know, those bands don't choose to introduce that element of unpredictableness, you know, which I think kind of might give it a bit more character. I think I don't listen to a lot of that music, although we do, I suppose, nominally play it, but I don't listen to a lot of it precisely because I feel like those bands are so processed and produced that I don't ever feel like, you know, you don't hear the amp hum, you know, you don't hear a string kind of plinking off weirdly, you don't hear any weird ringing, you don't hear the sound of the instrument because everything's so heavily compressed. And, you know, so I think that's for me at least, I think that's where a lot of that appeal comes from. And again, not necessarily in having an actual old pedal, for instance, but in having something that sounds like it's old, because I associate that kind of age with things that were made back then not being quite as precise or predictable. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, all you have to think about is that if you have, let's say you've got 10 caps, which isn't unusual, 10 caps and a few transistors and, an IC, a little op amp, and every one of those items have a plus minus 5% kind of range, operating range. So,
Yeah.
you can literally buy two pedals and they will sound entirely different because,
Yeah.
it's an addition. But so I don't want to stray too far off topic, but you said a shitload of interesting things. I guess that's partly the 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 problem, in my opinion, is that this has been talked about 100 million times. Why is it that bands now do that? Why do they want that precision all the time? Why do they want that predictability? Is it themselves? Yeah. Is it the YouTube Guitar Gear echo chamber, which tells everybody how and what things should sound like? Is it their management who wants that predictability? Is it the venues where the sound guys have just become lazy and said, "Look, man, just plug your DI, your IRs into my sound desk, so I don't have to do any work." Do you know what I mean?
Totally.
I mean, you hear the complaints from the old days. Somebody brings their 100-watt Marshall to a live venue, and it sounds different in every venue because the venues, their power is just not properly regulated. So you might plug it into 215 volt one night and then 225 volts the next day, and then they gotta deal with it. And I've never been to a half decent live show where the sound wasn't good and more than acceptable. More and more bands. There was a video just the other day. I think it was a Rick Beato video actually, and they were talking about how a lot of the bands now have backing tracks.
Yes.
Now, I don't really have a problem with, let's say I'm a 4-piece band and I want some keys and I want, a little bit of scratching here and there, but I only have 4 people. So I've got a pre-programmed set of violins or, whatever.
Yeah, we do that with my band. We have backing tracks.
Yeah, I don't see any issue with that because it's like obvious. But that's different from milli vanilling it, you know what I mean?
For our younger viewers, Milli Vanilli was a 2-piece back in the 80s that basically lost all their credibility because they didn't even sing on their own record.
Yeah. So it's but anyway, there is a middle ground there, which in my opinion is also a little bit funny, and that is that middle ground where I've basically done it now for my band. I've got the Valiton GP100. I've got everything programmed in. I'm using additional pedals with it, but I've got it so programmed that all I do is I plug the two outputs into the effects return of whatever amp is there. And
Yeah.
it's except for the speaker differences, everything else is the same, right? And it's easy, but at the same time, remember in the old days, you used to go to your jam room and you would plug all your pedals in, you plug the amps in, you never know what amp you got, and then you had to fuck around for like 20 minutes just to get a half decent sound between your pedals, your guitar, and whatever amp they gave you, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
that was
yeah.
half the fun, you know. And you, so on the one hand, it's like, okay, this is making life a lot easier to have this kind of reliable, predictable gear, and at the other hand, it's like, well, we've become it's all become a bit dad rock. It's all become a little bit
Yeah,
like
there's
sanitized
no
and
challenge
nice.
to it. Yeah. Yeah, it's a funny thing, you know. It's like again, I come back to sort of what I've been thinking about lately, and it's like I'd built up like I had, you know, two or three guitars that I was using, and the reason I was using them was because they were so perfectly dialed in for the style of music we were playing, you know. So I had this Ibanez, it's RG921, with like bare knuckle war pigs in it.
Okay.
And it was great, you know, it was really, really great. You know, it had this thin neck that felt beautiful to play and its big fat frets, and it was intonated perfectly, and it sounded amazing, and it worked perfectly with my rig. And then as a backup, I ended up getting this. I've still got it around actually. This Jackson Dinky, which again has like this pair of Seymour Duncans, and has a Floyd, so it stays perfectly in tune. And it has this super fast neck, 24 frets, all that kind of stuff. And like both these guitars are like uber metal and super easy to play, like the epitome of super strat, right? Like, you know, really fluid, no problems, loads and loads of fun. And I just I just got bored because they, you know, they don't fight you the way like a Telecaster does or a Les Paul, you know, where it's like it's a little bit harder to play. You have to work harder to make it sound good, especially a Telecaster. You know, it's like you have to kind of dig in and really make it work. And I think that sort of, I know we might be getting a little bit off topic, but not really, because I think when you know, Telecasters and Les Pauls, they're designs from the 50s. They're like old things nominally, even if the guitars themselves are new.
Yeah, I don't think it's off topic at all because I think part of the vintage gear problem is not just people who like old stuff, but it's also people who like a Telecaster because of its history, its heritage, and all the people that have played it,
Yeah.
right? So I don't think it's off topic at all. Um, the well, I can't talk about Telecasters because I absolutely despise them. Fender Squires and all those things. I just don't understand why people like them. It's like, oh, I've got an electric guitar. Let's see what's the thinnest sound I can possibly have today. It just baffles me, right? It's like the moment that dude went and designed a humbucker and put it in the guitar, it's like, why did they put anything else in the guitar ever again? I just don't understand. but that's my opinion and my taste,
Yeah.
obviously. But there was a guy so I'm saying this. I don't have a lot of experience with Telecasters. I only have this one. Um, there was a guy who needed it set up. So, and it was a
Yeah.
dirt cheap. It was one of those cheapest Telecasters you can buy. It looked really nice, but he had problems setting it up. So he gave it to me, and I cleaned it up. I reset it up. I polished the frets. I restrung it, and I plugged it into my PV Bandit on the dirt channel, and
Yeah.
I was like, oh, okay. This is actually not that bad. It has a real character to it. It's thin,
Yeah.
but it has a weird, very strange character to it. And I think there's a lot to be said about the mindset and the aesthetic, or the kind of musical aesthetic that the people had that designed both a thin sounding Fender amp with a mid scoop in those days,
Yeah.
and at the same time design a guitar with such a strange thin sound at the same time. So you can kind of put your mind back in those days and, well, this is what they were after, and this must have been like what they liked at the time. They were trying to
Yeah. Well, you
recreate
listen
the
to a lot of
sound
50s music.
of an acoustic or something. I don't know. It's weird.
Well, it's you know, old rock and roll from the 50s. It's all this very kind of jangly tone, isn't it? It's all
Yeah.
very sort of there's not a lot of low end in there. I mean, there's not a lot of low end in music from like before the 70s anyway, really. Not a huge amount of bass going on there. So the guitars occupy like a slightly higher register tonally because the bass really is occupying in those old records the space that now like the low mid range of a guitar would occupy. I feel like, you know, it's nothing like so. With my band, we play in drop A, so you know everything's baritone to begin with. So the bass starts at like, you know, A1 really. So it's like, um, you know, there's no way you could even have produced a record like that back in the 50s with the. I mean, I guess you could, but they certainly weren't doing it. But but I mean, I have the same feeling that you have about Telecasters and Strats. I have the same feeling about Fender amps.
Oh, I have the same feeling about
You know,
Fender amps, except the
yeah,
DeVoe.
yeah,
But we spoke about this the other day. But yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Um. So. Um. This is one that you have to deal with because you came up with this. Have we
Okay.
reached the peak of vintage? Or what did you say?
Yeah, this
Have we reached peak vintage?
peak vintage. Yeah, so it's I don't know. I mean, so it's something that's come up lately, and so I guess there's two sides to this question. And the first one is, are we at a point where, you know, people are kind of over it, you know, and they're like this sort of the we've been going on for years and years and years, and I think famously the sort of vintage prices had a massive peak in sort of 2006 to 2008, and then they dipped after like the global recession, and they've never really recovered from it, although things are getting more and more expensive again. But um, I guess it's really sort of because if we accept that vintage is kind of a generational thing, and like the people who are interested in those kinds of instruments, you know, that I think even if you know whether they're like 70 years old, in which case they'll actually remember when those instruments were like being extensively used first, or they're like, you know, like me in their 40s where they became aware of those instruments because the first generation of musicians were rediscovering them like in the 90s. um but I wonder, it's like, is there another generation coming that's going to be like, oh my god, I have to have a 64 Strat, oh my god, I have to have a 59 Les Paul, that kind of thing? Are they gonna um or uh, there's also the question of like the fact that guitar manufacturing and amp manufacturing, instrument manufacturing generally now has reached such a level of quality. Like, I mean, you know, as you mentioned earlier, it's like, so back in the day, cheap stuff was crap, you know, and now cheap stuff is pretty good, and then the expensive stuff is really amazing.
Yeah.
Um, you know, there might be less of a reason to kind of think of um, you know, older instruments as needing to be kind of like of a very high level in order to be great. And then I guess um the the second part of the question is really about kind of um is vintage like a fixed thing? Do we are we gonna start thinking of more recent instruments as vintage? Like, so, you know, now when we talk about vintage, what we're really talking about is instruments that were made sort of maybe up to the 80s at the outside. You know, so it's that kind of range between, say, 1950 and 1980. That's how old an instrument needs to be considered vintage. But are we going to start in the coming years? We're going to start having people talk about guitars from like the 90s as being vintage, or like guitars from the mid 2000s as being vintage, you know. And I just kind of wonder if that's something that And if that does happen, why is that? Is that just like, is that going to be like a marketing effort, or is it going to be because people genuinely feel that way about those things? It's a tough one. I don't feel like people are talking about like, you know, the Kurt Cobain Jag Stang, the originals, as like vintage guitars, even though enough time has elapsed, because that was what, 1993, 94. You know, the first ones that came out, those Kurt Cobain Jag Stangs, it's like no one's ever referred to those as being vintage, but it's like those are, you know, they're pushing 30 years old now. So it's like, does that mean that guitars that have been manufactured more recently are not really ever going to be described as vintage?
So I think that there are already some 90s equipment. I wouldn't say people refer to them as vintage, but people are already after them.
Yeah.
The problem probably with the Jag Stang, especially the kind of Kurt Cobain model, is that it didn't really exist. That he messed around with it. So anything that came after, as far as I understand, were recreations and kind of, dare I say, artist kind of recreations. But I mean, there are things that are already happening that people are pining for from the 90s, especially the dual rectifiers of that age, the cabs of that age, or the Mesa cabs of that age, the Kramers, shredders, the guitars. There are already a few things that are. So I'm wondering, like, maybe you're right. Maybe in a couple of years, maybe in a decade, people will stop referring to them as, you know, the kind of 90s gear, and they'll go, oh, the vintage gear. Don't know.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I you know, I for a while I had someone lent me like a 1991 Les Paul. You know, it was really great. It was a great guitar, but I don't feel like anyone's ever going to refer to that guitar as being like a vintage guitar.
No, but you know, I truly think that a lot of this has got nothing to do with the quality or the build or the tone or anything of the Gibson from '59 or anything like that. I think it all has to do with the music that made them famous at that time, and the sound, and it's become a lore. And I'm not saying they weren't good or they didn't sound good. I'm just saying I think it sometimes these things just kind of build up. You know, these legends are built upon kind of nothing sometimes. You know.
So you think it needs like a kind of a mythology to it?
I think so.
Rather,
I think so.
Yeah.
It's the same with cars. I mean, there's a lot of cars that were great, but there's only a handful that people really seem to want to, or that are really worth a lot in vintage form. And I think it's the same. It might have been in a movie, or it might have been, I honestly, it's one of those things I think about all the time. What makes one thing stand out and the other not, even though they are of equal quality at the time when they come out? And I'm talking about everything: movies, bands, singers, guitarists, you name it. I mean, you go. I'll give you an example. You go onto YouTube now or TikTok and you see some of the people and how they play guitar. And I'm not just talking about technically, but also musically, the amount of insane talent that we now have. And but we're still, we're still kind of talking about guitarists which are 100 times shitter than anybody is today. 100 times shitter. I mean, you think about some of the kind of Britpop stuff that came out in the 90s and stuff like that. I mean, these people were on my level of guitar playing, right? Fair enough, they wrote fine songs and all that, which is obviously important. You can't just be a good guitarist. You have to, like, make something beautiful with it. Fair enough. But from a pure kind of skill and musical talent point of view, there are people that are just better. And that's, it's not a dig at the people who came before us. It's not like, oh, they were shit, why are they famous? Everything progresses. If I'm really good at something today and I'm the best at it today, there will be somebody better down the line. I don't have to feel bad about it. It's just the way life works. So I'm not
Yeah.
trying to diss. I'm not dissing anybody to praise somebody else. What I'm trying to get to is this: what is it about our universe that makes one thing become famous and the other not? Like
Well,
Les Paul, what guitars did we have in the that we now refer to as vintage? We had Gretsch's, we had Les Pauls, we had Fenders, we had all sorts. And it's always find it funny when people say, you know, the Squire Stratocaster is kind of the ultimate guitar because it's absolute simplicity, being able to build it and all of that, right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I look at the Les Paul and I was like, I'm sorry, but the Les Paul is even more kind of simple to build, really.
Yeah.
In a way, if you take away the kind of nice things about it, like the binding stuff like that, if you just break it down to its kind of bare things, it's actually Les
Les Paul
Paul.
Jr., right?
Well, Les Paul Junior is just, I mean, fuck me, come on. There's two planks of wood and it's a grand. One
Yeah.
pickup, G pickup. That's another issue. I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole. Not today. Les Paul Junior
How
for
much these things cost? Yeah.
1,200 quid is literally like. I mean, they don't even bother to like make the piece of wood look nice or something. You know what I mean? It's just like, there you go. It's routed out. What you want?
Yeah. Quick sunburst. You just wrap around tailpiece. Off you go. Figure that one out. Yeah. But then it's, you know, people talk about the way they sound, and I think again that's sort of like, I think part of what attracts me to guitars like that, no, it's definitely not their price tag. It is the fact that like, you know, and this might just be like, you know, what we talk about, that sort of obsession versus logic, right? But I feel like the simpler the guitar is, the more I have to work hard to play it, and therefore the more character there will be in the sound I get out of it. If you see what I'm saying, you know, the more personal it will become, you know, because it's the result of a struggle as opposed to just, you know, giving you a PRS, right, that plays itself, you know. So I think that might be part of where that comes from. It's like the idea that you kind of have to earn it.
I have to agree with you there. I think that another addition to that is also that the simpler something is, the more the basic design can speak to you. Like if you have to create all these flourishes on something to make it pretty, it means that the base design and aesthetic of that piece is not strong enough. Or I mean, it can be strong enough. I'm just saying, like, if, and I think that's also why Les Pauls have. I still think that I would, if I had too much money, I'd probably one day buy a Gibson. I probably would. I couldn't say I wouldn't.
Yeah.
But I do have to say that they are probably aesthetically my favorite guitars.
Yeah.
And I think part of it has to do with the fact that they are, the design, the shape, everything is just lovely. I love the way that, although it's kind of a design flaw, but the way that the headstock just tilts back so far. It looks, there's something about it that looks good, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and then because they're made of wood, especially the ones that show the wood well.
Yeah.
You know, there's just something about them that they are kind of my favorites. I'm not into like kind of pointy, shreddy kind of looking guitars anymore. So
yeah,
I hope it's not because I'm
Yeah.
becoming an old man, but just the classic Les Paul and a good SG shape is my favorite. But I'm just talking about the shape. I'm not even talking about the brand or anything. I just like the shape. I like the simplicity. Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's like, I think there's a, you know, another thing that people often say is that they got it right, you know, the first time, like in the early 50s. You know, like you look at the 1952 Gold Top. or you know, well, with Fender, like, you know, the broadcaster or the nocaster or whatever you want to call it. It's like incredibly simple designs, single cutaway, you know, just a couple of pickups, you know, no fancy switching options, nothing like that.
Yeah.
Um, and I think those things, I think they probably continue to speak to people more than perhaps other guitar designs, because they do have that kind of, that there is a kind of simplicity to them. As you say, even when you get like a really elaborate Les Paul, you know, like a Les Paul Custom with the double binding and all that kind of stuff, it's still nominally quite a simple guitar, because
Yeah.
really, you know, there's three positions in volume and tone, and that's it. That's all you can do with it. The rest is up to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's also kind of why people like, you know, really big necks on those things as well, because, you know, essentially a bigger neck is kind of harder to play. But again, I think people kind of like that idea, because again, there's more of a challenge to it. So I think those are all kind of little parts of what make people kind of want those kind of. Although I would say something I heard recently, I don't know, it might have been in a video, like, about like a guy with an actual vintage guitar. So he was saying that a lot of the Gibson reissues of like the mid to late 50s guitars, you know, the custom shop reissues have much bigger necks than the actual guitars of the time did. You know, and that's because people kind of have this thing about having massive necks, and actually the vintage ones, that they're not really that big after all.
Yeah.
You know, but I think there's probably an aspect of earning it. I think there's, you know, to an extent, maybe even like bragging rights. Like, I have this guitar with a massive neck. You know, it's like, it's kind of yeah.
Yeah, but that's where the whole psychology and nonsense comes in. It's like, you know, there's been so much lore about X thing, so if I now have it, I am now at this level. Um,
Yeah.
which is obviously not the case. But there you go. Well, I I like my favorite kind of guitars, other than kind of like standard SG shapes and stuff like that, are actually at the moment the Dunable. The Dunable brand.
Donable. Okay, I'm gonna get my Google on 1 second.
Get your Google on, and you'll see what I mean. They also keep things simple. Um, I think they kind of market themselves to the stoners and the doomers, definitely. Um,
They kind of have like wait, hang on. So the ones I'm seeing, so they're like offsets. There's kind of like a Mosrite thing going on here with one of these.
the yeah the reason I'm mentioning them is because um, kind of trying to lead into the next thing is like, so we talked about, have we reached the peak of vintage, but
Yeah.
that would kind of indicate that there's nothing being created at the moment which in 30 years from now people will look back and go, oh my god, this is the stuff, this stuff was made in
Yeah.
2022 and it was just amazing, and it'll be years before somebody make. And I don't know, but if you look at how many pedal builders there are now, small, big, you name it, guitar builders, small, big,
Yeah.
everywhere, is maybe part of the issue is that there are too many now, and it might be a problem that a lot of the stuff is so good now and customizable. I think that's the other thing. Is like, we know how to customize our stuff now because
That's a really good point. That's a really good point, because scarcity, like, okay, so you think about the 59 Les Paul, right? Which is probably let's say it's the most desirable guitar ever made to date, right? Probably the most expensive, definitely, just on average.
yeah,
To get a 59 Les Paul. And they were so unpopular that they only made them for another year. And then they discontinued that model until 1968. So in a way, it's like perhaps that has something to do with you know, with its kind of, you know, its whole mystique now. I mean, they only really made the Les Paul standard between 1957 and 1960, and then they stopped making it. for like 8 years.
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to mention that, then you could also theorize that there's many industries and many companies that have artificially created a rarity in something
Yeah,
in many different shapes and forms in order to bring the price up of something negligible to some sort of, you know, high price and being revered. Diamonds is a good example. You know, diamonds aren't as rare
yeah,
as they say. You know, that we all know that now. You know, maybe it was planned. Maybe they had some marketing genius and they went, you know what, these poles aren't selling now, but wait a few years and we'll pull these little stunts and tricks, and then people will want them
yeah.
until the end of days.
It's possible. I mean, yeah. I mean, it certainly wasn't doing well. So maybe they had that. Well, because they introduced the SG in 1961, didn't they, to kind of replace it? Because that they called it the Les Paul for the first year,
Yeah, that's right.
and then they took the Les Paul off because Les Paul himself didn't like it. But I guess it's possible that that's what they kind of had in mind the whole time because they did after all. I don't know why they reintroduced it in 1968. But it's certainly true that like from the I think it was from pretty much from the late 60s, early 70s it's onwards, like people start talking about like, you know, really sort of well-known guitar players having kind of rediscovered the Les Paul as like the ultimate rock guitar, you know, the sort of the Paul Kossoff types, you know.
Yeah.
Um so so perhaps it was planned all along. But yeah, but I totally hear what you're saying. There's so many, there's so much out there now that it's really hard to kind of look at something and go, that's definitely going to be the thing that people are talking about 30 years from now as being like the best of what was being made.
There's also
Um,
sorry, carry on.
no, I was just going to say, in part because it's like, so much of this stuff that's coming out now is so amazing. You know, it's like you know, in the 50s, it's like Gibson was one of maybe three or four kind of guitar manufacturers that was making like really, really high level kind of electric guitars.
Yeah.
Um, you know, and so that was kind of, you either had that or a Fender or maybe a Gretsch or what, like a catalog guitar, like some guitar out of a Sears catalog that was just a piece of shit that would fall to bits, you know.
Well,
And it's like,
we have a couple of what do you call them? You know, these shops where all the old shit is. What do you call it? You know, furniture and all that stuff.
oh yeah, like an
Antique
antique
shop. Yeah.
store or something. Yeah,
And every now and then, you know, I like just lolling around there, and there are some old guitars from the 50s and 60s.
yeah,
Oh my god. And if it's not Gibson or Fender, the stuff is like, how could you possibly build such a thing or play it,
yeah.
right? It's just these massive awful clumps, and it's just all these weird things on it and 50 switches and unbelievable awful stuff. I'm so glad I didn't live in that time. I probably would never have played guitar if I lived in those days. So you can kind of see
Yeah,
if
well,
that was the competition, you can understand why Fender and Gibson made it. You know what I mean?
yeah. Well, it's like all those Soviet guitars that have kind of started to filter back west. You know, the ones that they were making in like the, you know, the 60s and 70s and even the 80s to an extent. You know, all those things that is these weird kind of melted looking copies of Strats in this sort
Yeah,
of
yeah,
just bizarre kind of, you know, all these weird brands. You know, just like, um, and all of them are just. I mean, you could just tell by looking at photos of them that they're just basically unplayable. Like they have trems on that you like. If I use this, it's not gonna just put the guitar out of tune. It's gonna break it. You know,
yeah,
and it's like. But that obviously they couldn't import any Western guitars, you know, so that's what they had to use and deal with. But because they were being made in Soviet factories, they were being made by like, you know, these people who just didn't give a shit about instruments and, you know, just made like awful crap out of anything, you know, and it's just like there's no sense of quality, nothing. And you know, I think it's like I think you have to go further east, like to like the Japanese kind of Taiscos, to find any from that era that are sort of worth looking at. And even, I mean, I hear like most of those guitars are pretty terrible as well. I think Japan only really got their manufacturing act together kind of in the 80s, really, like late 70s maybe, from then on. Um, but yeah, but I mean, still, I mean, I think most people think of Japan as a really great place to pick up vintage American guitars, not so much, you know, all the decent Japanese guitars are the ones that are being made now, like
Yeah.
from the 90s onwards, you know. So yeah, that's interesting. But I mean, do you think there's scope for like people to think? Because I remember like in the 90s, um, people didn't talk about like Japanese Fenders in the way that they do now. Like people think of Japanese Fenders now as being amazing and like better than the American ones. But like I remember in the 90s, people didn't say that. They were just like it was just like Japanese was kind of like the same as getting like a Mexican Fender or something like that.
Mm.
So yeah. So I guess perceptions can change in that sense. So that does kind of lead towards the idea that maybe like in the future, the perception of a certain type of guitar, a certain brand of guitar or whatever will change to where at the right now it's not thought of as being anything particularly special, but you know, in the future people will be like, oh no, this stuff was the shit, you know.
Well, I
Yeah.
want, well, uh, something came to my mind while you were talking earlier. And it's like I think one of the other problems that we have now is that there's so many good brands, and on top of that, every brand constantly brings out new stuff, the next best thing, the next big thing, the next big thing. So it's just this overload of choice.
Yeah.
But for I think for something to become a legend, there has to be mystique around it.
Yes.
So if the legend of the famous Gibsons and Fenders, they've always been like the go-to stuff, and they've always been like the good stuff through all the years. It's only really been the last 15 years, 10 maybe 15 years, where we really can understand, find out, dig into every single brand. So what I mean is, like, before that, you would buy a magazine and they would have something in there, or your pal at the pub would talk about guitars and you think he knows a lot. Nowadays, if I want to know something about any guitar, I can find it out at the drop of a hat. There's no secrets
Yeah.
there anymore. So, and if there's no secrets anymore, there's no legend. There's not that unknown, that mystique around something. And I think that also relates to why we have a problem with why there's no, that whole thing people have been going on about probably the last 5 years is why don't we have big proper rock bands anymore? Why is everything kind of dad rocky? Why is everything so the samey? I think it's all the same
Yeah.
problem. We just have too much access to too much knowledge, which means we don't know what to decide, or we follow what everybody else is saying we should be doing with guitar tone, with what guitar to buy, and you know all that kind of stuff.
That's
So I
yeah,
think
that's definitely that.
being able to create a legend, I don't think it would have to be something awfully special. Um, I suppose now compared to what it used to be.
Well, that's really interesting because it's like what you're saying about like because you know we mentioned earlier like it's also the association with the artist that kind of makes these instruments special, right? I think what you're saying just there is really true. Like there isn't any mystique, not just for like instrument manufacturer, because if you want to find out how an instrument is made, you could just go on YouTube and see a factory tour.
Yeah,
And there's 100 million videos about like you know, some guy buying a guitar and taking it apart and analyzing it and all this kind of
yeah,
stuff. And everyone knows everything there is to know about, you know, the original guitars and blah blah and the new guitars. And you know, people get really scientific in this stuff because it's a marketing effort because people really want to know. But the artists, but by the same token, it's like it's a given now. And I think it's like I think it was Rabia Massad who was saying, you know, in a video recently that he was kind of sad that like a lot of the bands he grew up listening to, he didn't really know anything about them other than the sort of the tiny little snippets of information that you get in a magazine that you could buy every 2 months. But now it's like they're on social media every day. Here's my breakfast. Here's the trousers I'm wearing today.
Yeah.
And here's my entire rig. Let me break it down for you. I use these jacks and these picks, and here's why I use these strings, and here's what I do when I'm playing live, and here's the effects I have at home, and here's the rig I use to practice in the hotel room, and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And it demystifies the entire process. So there is no longer any mystique to it.
Yeah.
And in a way, I mean, what we're doing right now is kind of part of that. The fact that everything is kind of dragged out into the open for everyone to kind of pick apart. And because of that, it's going to be, there won't be a situation in 30 years time where there's any question about this or that guitar that was made now, because it's all documented and it's all there forever and in very, very fine detail. There isn't some guy squirreled away making some guitar that there won't be any information about in 30 years, and people have to make educated guesses about what could possibly have informed this decision, and why did this artist choose to play it, and what was that relationship, and all that kind of stuff. And to an extent, I mean, just to get dark for a second here as well, I think sort of because of that sort of corporatization of artists and so on, everything's kind of so sanitized now. There won't be that thing where it's like, uh, this you won't get your Peter Greens and your Sid Barretts and people like that going completely insane and just disappearing into the ether, and you won't get your Amy Winehouses and all those kinds of people just kind of overdosing, or even your Axl Roses going absolutely bananas and just kind of completely losing the plot, because first of all, those people don't get signed anymore, I don't think. I mean, even if getting signed is even still a thing. But also the fact that the people who are getting signed, if that still is a thing, it's like Ed Sheeran is not going to die face down in some club toilet. He just isn't. It's like, even Kanye West, who is absolutely completely insane, right? It's like he's not at risk the way Kurt Cobain was at risk, and no one did anything about it. He's got people managing him. And that's all part of that.
I think they gave up on him, man. Honestly, by what's happening with us. I think there's
yeah, that's probably true, to be fair, yeah. But even so, I mean, we still know every tiny thing about his life, right? Whereas we didn't know what was, Kurt Cobain disappeared for like 10 days and then we found his body. I mean, imagine that happening to like the biggest rock star on earth now. It just you couldn't imagine that, because everything is so publicized and so, open to scrutiny. And I think, as you say, it's the mystique of it. It's completely gone. And I think that it's maybe that ingredient that now is missing from so much kind of alternative music, rock and roll, whatever you want to call it. It's just it's not really there anymore, because we know everything there is to know about these people, and for our purposes, we know everything there is to know about their equipment and how they use it. So, yeah, maybe there won't be that kind of, people gazing up wistfully at a poster of a guitar, wondering what it is.
Yeah.
Because I didn't know, say, for instance, like, I was a huge Guns N' Roses fan in the 90s. Like a lot of guys my age, I imagine. And I had all these posters of Guns N' Roses on my wall, and being a guitar player is like I wanted to be Slash, right? And so there he was up there with his Les Paul, but I knew what it looked like. But it would be 15 years before I found out that it wasn't actually a Gibson, that it was some luthier replica made by some guy called Chris Derrick.
And
even then, like,
and stuff that was recorded before that was probably recorded with the what's it called, the guitar played
like
for
a BC Rich.
BC Rich,
like it was a beat. Yeah. So it's like you didn't know any of that stuff, but now you do. It's like your best chance at guessing how it was made was by reading the liner notes in the cassette tape to see, like, if it said, Guns N' Roses play X guitars and Y amplifiers or whatever. That would happen sometimes if you were lucky, but you just didn't get that kind of information.
And the stuff wasn't necessarily accurate either.
No, that's true.
I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
they go back to Slash, who was, and you ask Slash now, what did he use on Appetite for Destruction when he was recording it 30 years later, and at the time when he was recording it, he was half fucking cut all the time anyway.
yeah, that's true.
Then in the
Yeah,
studio, we all know, we've all been in the studio before. You don't go in with your guitar and play only your guitar and your amp. You've got like all the
yeah,
shit to choose from, and you do whatever, you use whatever. So trying
yeah.
to then go and say, well, okay, whatever these guys remember, or what the
Well, there you
producer.
go. There's a perfect example. There's a perfect example right there because the amp that Slash used on Appetite for Destruction was well that he mainly used on Appetite for Destruction was a JCM 800 that he hired from a company in LA called SIR, and then it got returned, and then no one knows where that amp is. So it's like all of these amp manufacturers who presumably would be absolutely desperate to find this specific amp and to take it apart and analyze it and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, they can't because no one knows what amp it was anymore. It's like it's gone, it's disappeared. You can't have it anymore. That just wouldn't happen these days.
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. No, I think that's, there's a few issues like it's going off topic now, and I don't mind because I think it goes. I think the vintage in most things there's probably a similar theme, but I think in music gear, in amps and guitars and pedals even, I think that the this vintage hype is completely intertwined with the music of the day that it came from and the artists that played them. I don't think you could
Yeah,
realistically separate the two completely anyway. But now, look at today's bands. Like, I disagree that guitar. I don't fully disagree, but I do disagree to a certain extent that guitar music is dead and that there's no good guitar stuff out there. It is out there. There is amazing stuff, and I'm not just talking about TikTokers and YouTubers. I'm also talking about bands. The
yeah,
truth is that they are not massive rock stars flying around in their private jets. That is true.
yeah,
But they
yeah.
are
That's gone. Yeah,
insanely. There are people. I'm gonna go and watch Brutus next Friday in Glasgow. I can't fucking wait, right?
yeah,
To me, they are like Guns N' Roses was when I first heard them.
yes,
Like so many bands that I like Nirvana when I first heard them. That's the same. These guys are giving me the same hard on. They just do, right?
yeah,
And the but they will to a certain degree come and go, and they will be loved by by less people, but they will be
yeah.
just as much loved. But therein lies the problem. They will never create a a new sort of the guitar 30 years from now. Then there's the
Yeah.
other issue is like um, nearly every band that has made it. Oh, man, I can go on for this about hours. So the gig next Friday, the doors open at 7. The main gig is
Yeah.
like 8 and 9. Fuck me, man. We used to have to go to a gig and then you had to wait until, if you're lucky, 12 o'clock, the main band will come on. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You'd be there till 4 o'clock in the
Yeah.
morning. Pretty much every band now has a big concert. And next thing you see, there's a fucking kid on stage playing guitar for them. Oh, come
Yeah.
up. It's like, what is this now? A kindergarten. It's like, this is a rock show. And suddenly you've got Dave Grohl bringing Little Wayne's onto the fucking stage to play.
I was gonna say, yeah, you
It's
see
like
the
a-
Foo Fighters,
what
right?
the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And it's not just them. It's like, no wonder rock's dead. You invite the Crash to come hang out with you. I mean, where's the drugs? Where's the whores? Where's the fucking, hotel rooms busted up? Now, I know I sound like, people have said this before, but I think that also creates this problem where you have everything is a little bit too clean.
I mean, both of us are Generation X, aren't we? So I think we both have that thing where we came up listening to music from, made in the 80s and 90s, where basically a lot of the core stuff that we listened to was made by young guys who were maybe a little bit older than us at the time. But
Just
like they wrote a bunch of songs and then they gave them millions of dollars and they said, do what you want with it. So they did what a bunch of young guys would do with millions of dollars, and they went and bought a bunch of drugs and they partied like fuck. And
Exactly what I
so
would
there
do
was always
now.
that.
If I...
It was so dangerous. If they, it's like they described Guns N' Roses as the most dangerous band in the world, didn't they? And it's like because they had that lifestyle, and I mean, to be fair, it killed a lot of them. So I suppose that is there is nominally an improvement in that sense. But I completely agree with you that it has taken the edge off the music. I mean, think about it, like because they went and did all that crazy shit, and then they came back and they wrote really original, inspired music, probably because they were so crazy and their lives were so crazy. And now it's like you can't write crazy music if you like, your routine is you get up at 7 a.m. and you go for a jog and then you go to the juice bar and then you meet your nutritionist and
Yeah.
and then you have a meeting with your lawyers and then one of your 19 managers to talk about how many people are going to produce your next single. It's like
Yeah.
there's no
No,
there's nothing about that isn't safe.
yeah, and I think we need to clarify for whoever is the one or two people who will see this is like we are talking about this not because we're pining for the past, but because we're talking about this in the context of will there be vintage gear in the future that comes from our era?
Yeah,
And I think
I
that's
don't know,
why
man. I'm pining for the past. I want
no,
it
no,
back,
yeah,
man.
no, absolutely. I mean, there are certain things I do pine for from the past, that's for sure. And I think everybody will go through that as they grow old,
Yeah.
and do the old in my day, for sure. Um, there was something I was going to say, but it kind of flew out of my head. But it's I am not dissing Foo Fighters for being big and bland as hell and having kids on
Yeah.
stage, because there's millions of people who love them, and I let people have their taste and I don't have any issue with it, but it's not my thing.
Yeah.
But the one effect that this sort of culture now does have, this kind of like everything needs to be kind of sanitized so that I think
It's all inclusive.
the inclusivity, that good word. I think it does bland everything else out, and it creates this place where we don't have that mysticism, we don't have that, oh my god, somebody actually really did something bad, or and I think we need
Yeah.
it. I mean, it's awful to say, but we do, we like that drama. Then there's another thing, I think it was actually Rabia as well, some YouTube channel was talking about it. It's like the kids nowadays, the younger
Yeah.
musicians who make it and who tour and do stuff like that, there's very few of them who pine after some super expensive, traditionally expensive kit. They buy something that they like. They'll buy an Ibanez or they'll buy a Strat. They buy what they want and they use it. It's a tool. They don't have this
Yeah.
issue that some of the boomers, dare I say, have, where if I play rock music, I've got to play it with a Les Paul.
Yeah.
If I play Southern blues, I've got to get a Telecaster. Whatever. You know what I mean? They don't have
Yeah.
these issues. They buy gear, they make music with it, and they get on with things. And I like that. I think that's a good way to go.
Yeah. To what extent do you think that's informed by like a commercial consideration? Because take Chris Buck, for example, who was a guy who, I think of as being like a sort of let's say he's a blues player and he plays in this soul blues band, and his playing is very much influenced by like, old school classic blues rock kind of stuff. And there's lots of videos on his channel of him kind of, testing out vintage bursts and, playing, old gold tops and, old strats and all that kind of stuff, but vintage gear essentially. and it fits in well with his style and aesthetic because, like I say, he's sort of this old blues guy. And then it seems like he's kind of done some sort of deal with Yamaha, right? So now he's playing this sort of Revstar guitar almost exclusively. And I'm not saying it's a bad guitar. I haven't actually played one, and you know, the reviews all seem to say that it's a, you know, perfectly decent guitar. And why wouldn't it be? Because it's essentially just like a flat top Les Paul, really, with a double cutaway, you know, couple of humbuckers, you know, hardtail bridge, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It looks fine. But really what it is sort of it's like the modern Yamaha, like, you know, the SG
Yeah.
1000, 2000, you know.
Yeah, I love
That's really
Revstars.
what it is. And so, you know, but it makes me think, like, you know, is he playing that because, like, he's chosen that specific guitar, or is he in fact playing that because I notice he's also using like I think he's using like a Line 6 Helix as well, right? And that's now because Yamaha's bought Line 6. So that's also like a Yamaha product. You know, and I'm theorizing here. I'm not accusing him of anything, but I'm just saying, like, is that decision, like, to move away from sort of what we think of as, you know, even if he's playing a custom shop Les Paul reissue or a custom shop Strat reissue, it's like nominally sort of vintage style gear. Now he's playing this sort of modern Yamaha, which kind of does the same thing, and he's not using old valve amps. He's using this pedal board. Is that a commercial decision because he's entered into a deal with Yamaha and made those decisions, or you know, I mean, what do you think?
I think that it's most likely a combination. Like, from personally, I would like to play the guitar that I want to play. But
Yeah,
you can understand that if somebody like Revstar comes to you and says, "Hey man, could you be our artist? Here's some guitars to choose from. We'll even customize it for you." I'd jump well into that, but that's because it's Revstar. But if it was Fender, I would probably say no. Unless there's a shitload of money involved, I probably would say no because I don't want that thing in my hands.
yeah,
But then there's another thing, is that I think that the this block has been broken down. This barrier from I'm an artist, so I have to have like a really expensive, cool valve amp and stuff.
yeah,
That it's we are now in a situation where, man, if I want to use a Helix even for live, then I'll use it, and I'm not gonna get slated so much as I was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So I think
yeah. Well, that's probably
people just use what they think is going to work for them and sounds good enough. If I would hope to think that if it didn't sound good enough for him, his guitar and his Helix or whatever he's using, that I would hope that he would probably not use it.
yeah.
But
That's also part of the demystification as well, isn't it? Because I think also people understand better now why someone would choose to use a Helix for touring.
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
because it makes sense to use a Helix for touring. Because why wouldn't you? You can just carry it on, and you know, you can take it in your backpack, and you can take it on the plane with you, and it's fine. And then you can just do all your gigs with that. So that does make sense as a touring artist. I mean, you know, Rabea uses a quad Cortex when he's touring. He doesn't take any amps with him or anything like that. Um,
but I don't
that
understand
makes
that, right? If like I can completely understand why you would, again, maybe a bit off topic. I can understand why you would want a Helix or quad Cortex, and that's your full rig. But surely it must depend on the style of music that you play. Um, if I'm a massive doom band, that just won't work for me.
no, you
If
need your big orange stacks behind you,
you
don't you?
need that push, you need that feedback, you need that amp behind you to play with the feedback and all that. If you play hyper technical math metal, okay, fine, quad Cortex all day long, no problem.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I suppose there is still, well, hopefully, like a consideration. Well, what music am I playing? What am I trying to convey? Will I be able to get away with quad Cortex? Will I be able, or do I need my orange stack behind me? Um,
Do you think it's like for an artist at that level? Because obviously, if you're a massive artist and you're traveling with techs and loads of trucks full of stuff, you can take what you want with you. And if you're Joe Perry, you're okay. But it's like, do you think it's do you think it would be viable for anyone, say at the level, where you're playing to like venues that hold maybe 5,000 people? Do you think it makes sense these days, the idea to insist on using your, let's say, your 1964 Vox AC30? Do you think that makes any kind of sense, or do you think that's just flat dumb?
No, I don't think it makes sense, but I do think that it again. I think I know what you mean. So please correct me if I'm not answering this right. But I do think that for certain genres and certain music, that if you want to convey the energy and the ambience that you are required to convey, you need an amp behind you, with you on
Mm.
stage, your amp that you are plugged into. Now, whatever is going to the front of house, whatever you're driving into the PA, whether it's the amp mic'd up or you're paralleling a quad cortex with all your sounds into the desk, that's a different
Yeah,
story. But I think
yeah,
that there are certain genres where you just need that amp behind you. Now, whether that is the amp and your sound that you want to get into the desk or not, that I don't think that matters anymore. Because I'll tell you, the way I'm recording at the moment, I'm using the Valaton, and I'm literally splitting it. The Valaton's doing all the amp emulation except the cab emulation, all the amp emulation, everything, and my own pedals through that goes into an amp, and the other
yeah,
line goes into Reaper. So it means I can play. I am playing with my amp. I'm getting the feedback from
yeah,
my amp. Everything is happening with my amp, so that I feel like I am playing through an amp. However, what's recorded is a different story, and so I don't see that as a problem doing it that way. Um,
mm.
even on a live situation. So having a half decent amp with you and the quad cortex or something, I think is probably, in my opinion, the best solution. Because that's not much like a combo amp,
Yeah.
50-watt combo. Put it on a desk next to you when you're playing live, and everything else can go to the desk. Emulate it. I don't see an issue. I don't.
In- yeah. Increasingly, I agree with you. Because like up until now, really, it's like I mean, I've been using amp simulators, like software, for years and years and years. I had like the first version of like Guitar Rig, and that's how I've been recording stuff, mainly through necessity, because it's like, I couldn't always afford like the amps that I wanted to play, and so it gives you loads of options. And I've been using lately like the Neural DSP plugins, because I mean they are, let's face it, they are really good. But at the same time, I feel like what I'm gaining in ease of production, because they are really easy to produce with, I'm also losing because I'm mainly producing my own music. And I always feel like the performance side of it is always a little bit flat, a little bit kind of lacking in character, a little bit emotionless. I'm sort of, it's by the numbers. I'm just filling in tracks. Um, and because of that, it's like I've decided that I want to bring a real amp back into my studio. I mean, apart from the fact that I think it will be better, say, for doing things like for demoing effects pedals, for instance. I think it's like you really need to put those into a real amp, to really hear what they sound like when you turn up the amp and all that kind of stuff. You can't really demo an effects pedal by plugging it into your interface. Um, but also just because it'll I'll have a better experience. But yeah, so I wanted to ask you. So um what's your experience of vintage gear, like, personally?
I've not had much vintage gear in my existence at all. There was the main, we had a band early on in when was this, 94, 95, and we were dirt poor. We were playing shitty amps. I had a Laney combo, and my friend had like Oh no, he had a. Did he have a valve state? No,
I
he had a
remember Valve
Bandit. He
State.
had a Bandit. The old Bandits, the 80s
And
Bandit,
it.
the ones that had the
Yeah.
trans tube in it, but wasn't marked with the trans tube.
Yes.
And we went to this one place. It was like a open band day. A place they were always open. It was like a bar and open band. And it was like just some guys that ran this place. And we brought our gear, and then they said, "Oh, you can use our Voxes." And I went, "Oh, fine." And we played our mid 90s grunge stuff through these Voxes, and I'll never forget it. I just won't. It was just one of those things. I was blown away. It's not something I would do now, but at the time, to me, it was just unbelievable. Because maybe it had a lot to do with the fact that we've never, up to that point, played through anything decent, and this was the first proper decent amp to play through and really loud and all that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I wouldn't buy a Vox now. It's not my thing, but I just remember how fucking jacked up I was with the tone I had that day. It was something else. That's probably the closest to vintage, because it was a proper old, Vox 15 crank to the max. It was something. Oh, there was another occasion. That was a weird one. So we had another band about 10 years ago, and we went into a recording studio. I was just playing bass. Went into a recording studio here in Glasgow, and I did my bass, the drummer did his bit, I did the bass, and then the guy who kind of ran the band, he had his valve state, the good one, the 80-20 or 80-10 something, whatever. And he was absolutely adamant he wanted to record through it. And I had a Vox there. And the engineer was constantly trying to convince him, no, use the Vox, use the Vox, use the Vox. And he said, no, I want to use my valve state. No, use the Vox, use the Vox. No, I want to use my valve state. But then again, the stuff we were doing at the time suited the valve state. It didn't suit the Vox. It's just simple as that, No, I don't have a huge amount of experience with real vintage gear. If some of my pedals are throwbacks to the tone benders and the fuzz faces, the silicon, not the germanium ones.
Yeah.
And I basically made a blend between the fuzz face and the tone bender, and old silicon transistors, and it's pretty much as they are. The only difference is that the bias control is on the outside. So this whole sputter that you get from having too much or too little voltage onto the transistors and all that, it's all recreatable. And I completely see the appeal of them, because there is so in my opinion, fuzz faces and tone benders don't sound nice by themselves.
Yeah.
But the moment that you crank them and you add a bit of reverb and delay, they suddenly become this cream.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I think that, so to me, that is, from a vintage point of view, that is a tone that we took from the old days, and we're still implementing it today successfully in a lot of genres. And I don't want to say it's the pedal that is actually the good part, but it's actually some of the really beautiful tones that you can scope out of it. Because you think of a fuzz as this kind of gnarly, scratchy thing, but the moment you just deal with it a little, it becomes this creamy singing tone.
Yeah.
And yeah,
I think it's interesting what you're saying, because it kind of it tells me that a lot of the, because obviously, I mean, a lot of people will justify their interest or obsession or whatever you want to call it with vintage gear as it being like a thing about like the sound of it, right? The tone. But I think what you're saying is like, actually, getting tones is more about the approach to how you use your gear, not how old the gear is, you know, that kind of thing. And I think it's kind of interesting because my personal experience with vintage gear is like, again, it's not, I haven't played a lot of, I certainly never played like a 59 Burst or anything, but the first piece of vintage gear I ever played was an early 70s Strat, and it was owned by a guy who was producing a piece of music that I was recording for some theater thing. Anyway, long story. I won't bore you with the details, but it being an early 70s Strat, and this was the mid 90s, this thing had been absolutely butchered, right? So it was like, it had like, I don't, maybe it was the DiMaggio, I don't know, but it had a humbucker wedged into the bridge, and it was just absolutely, I think it'd been refinished. It was just absolutely trashed, and it had like this really horrible kind of thin neck, and it was heavy as fuck. It was like one of the heaviest guitars I've ever put on. Um, and it sounded like it was awful. It sounded so bad. And I just thought this if this is what old gear is, then I don't ever want to own any old gear, you know. And it's like, so obviously, you know, bad experience. I'm not saying all old guitars are like that, but I kind of felt like, because up until that point, I'd really only ever played like super cheap guitars. Like my guitar at the time, my main guitar was like a Les Paul copy. Um, and I don't know where it was made, but it was a brand called Carson, and that was definitely Far Eastern, but I don't know if it was like Chinese or what. Um, and it was a playable copy, but it had humbuckers in it, and I had a reasonable amplifier at the time. I had a Hughes and Kettner Attax 80, which is like one of those things like a valve. It didn't have a valve in it, but it like had a valve emulation circuit in
Yeah,
it and
yeah, yeah.
everything, and it sounded okay. And you know, and it sounded so much better than that Strat. It was just really, really horrible. And I felt like I knew how to make the Les Paul sound good, but that Strat just totally confused me. And to this day, I've never been able to get on with Strats. Never been able to do anything with them.
No,
Absolutely insane.
no. I had a Strat copy, and I put hot rails in the bridge, and that kind of saved it for me for a couple of years. But eventually, I had enough of it because even with the hot rails, it just still sounded thin. But
Yeah.
um, again, I was gonna say something, it just went poof. The
It's okay.
you might want to
But
back up a bit.
in terms of what we're talking about, like with the tone thing, a piece of vintage gear that I've actually owned, and again, I don't know if you'd call it vintage per se, but it was one of the first ones to be made, so probably it was a Boss DD3. So it was
Oh,
one of the first DD3s to be made. This was right after they discontinued the DD2 in the mid 80s. So the one I had was a black label Japanese made 1986 DD3, and it had the long delay chip in it that apparently they don't do anymore or something, and it's supposed to be better than the. And I've owned like 5 or 6 DD3s, as probably most guitar players have. And honestly, like I owned this thing for a few months, and it sounded absolutely identical to any other DD3 I've ever played. And people will fucking go on for days about how you've got to have this long chip and it's got to be blah, 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 and this kind of stuff. And to me, for a DD3, it's just basically a really clean delay, right? All it does is repeat the sound. It doesn't have any inherent warmth. It doesn't have any modulation. The only controls are like how much of it you have and like what the speed and repeats of delay are. So it's like it's very straightforward. It's just digital delay. It's supposed to be clean. So I don't understand why people make the distinction between the new ones and the old ones, because as it should be, it was completely identical.
well,
So yeah,
there's so many layers to this. Remind me of this that we were talking about the DD3 and that. I just remembered one of the things that I've always wondered about, especially vintage guitars, is if I go to my local pawn shop and there's a half decent brand in there that is maybe 3 or 4 years old that somebody's been playing for 2 or 3 years, you look at the frets and they're half worn down. So imagine a
yeah,
30-year-old guitar. So either the frets have been replaced 50 times or they are worn to shit. Why would I want that?
Yeah.
It's unplayable. Something with worn frets is unplayable. What you said about the pedal is so typical. Now, if you, and I'm not going to deny them this, but if you talk to the real gurus who make these claims, they will give you decent reasons why, that's the one you should have. Just like with the Rat, with the OCD, which revision, with the
which tube screamer, yeah.
You name it, right? So, and on top of that, then we've got two things. One is the likes of Brian Wampler. You and I have talked about this before, and JHS and them kind of saying, "Come on, don't be fucking stupid. The shit's all the same. It's the circuit, what, right?" But then you also have the more important other side of this. It's like, we don't make the community that we're in, that are probably going to watch this video and bitch and moan about it, the most of the things we say are irrelevant. And the reason they are irrelevant is because we and them should be making music for the people out there, not for ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, so that means that those people that hopefully listen to your shit on Spotify or go to your gig or buy your album don't give two shits about which chip was in your delay pedal. They don't even know what a delay pedal is. So who cares? The damn thing sounds fine. If it's vintage or new, it just shouldn't matter. We should stop this kind of echo chambering little community where, because that's why I said when I started this rant of mine was like, there will be people who will call you out as being stupid and dumb because why don't you know why that DD3 is better than the others? And they'll give you tons of plausible reasons. But at the end of the day, who cares? I just don't understand it. It's like, if I want vintage gear because it is worth a lot of money or it'll gain a worth in the future and I can resell it, if it's an investment, if it's a hobby, if it's just purely an aesthetic love for it, completely understand it. But the moment it gets into this territory from it's better, it sounds better, it was built better, all this kind of stuff, then I start losing interest, because that's not a legitimate, in my opinion, not a legitimate reason for it.
I agree with you, and I totally hear what you're saying on both fronts. I think I'm kind of I vacillate between the two positions, because I completely agree that the guy in the crowd doesn't even know what, even if he knew what vintage gear was, he wouldn't be able to tell whether your Strat is from last week or from 1955, right? So it makes no odds to him. His enjoyment of the music would be the same. So we have to, when thinking of ourselves as like entertainers, we have to try and kind of it's a completely moot point. It doesn't make any odds. At the same time, there is that kind of part of me that goes, well, in order to make the best music that I can, I need to be like, on some level, I need to be in love with the instruments that I'm playing, if you see what I'm saying. So, and I'm not necessarily saying in order for that to happen, they have to be a vintage instrument or whatever. And like I say, I've never really
connection.
Yeah, you have to have a connection. I think for some people, I think they feel that connection more for whatever reason, if that's a 1961 whatever, or if it's someone's granddad's thing. It's like Joe Bonamassa, right?
But that is a full-on legitimate reason, in my opinion.
Yeah.
That's why I said that is 100% cool with me. But they mustn't then try and explain that is better. That is kind of the difference between saying, well, my 59 Les Paul really inspires me. I just want to pick it up and play. Get it.
Well,
feel it.
Let me just bring something over. So here we go. Here's my vintage Les Paul, right? This is it's a 2001 Les Paul, which is plenty old enough in my book, because I mean, 20 odd years is pretty old, right? And so I'm obviously it's not finished yet, but um, I've been making some videos about rebuilding this. I bought this as a husk. It didn't have any pickups. It didn't have anything in it. It was completely destroyed, and I had to refinish the top and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I guess my point is that it is. I mean, I've owned what, maybe 6 Les Pauls or something, and I think I haven't even had that plugged in yet. But I can tell you, like, it's certainly in the last 10 years, it's the most excited I've ever been about owning a guitar. And I think it's probably to do. It's obviously it's to do with the fact that it's a personal project. It's also to do with the fact that I kind of, from hearing it acoustically, I think it's going to be a good one. There is an aspect to it though that it's like, for some reason, I like the idea that it's like, it's not really old because I couldn't afford it if it was really old, but it's like, it's quite old.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? It's like it's old enough. It's that kind of thing, and I don't know why I get a kick out of that, but I sort of do, and it makes it adds to it. It's not the whole thing. It's like I'm never gonna I wouldn't ever refer to it as vintage, not really, but but for me it's just like a little personal little plus, So I don't know. Maybe that's the key to vintage instruments in the future.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. But is it vintage or is it just the love for the thing? This thing weighs an absolute ton.
Yeah.
This neck was 50 quid from China through Amazon. And I got this neck. It is as smooth as any new guitar you can buy. And it was a Rockburn SG body.
Yeah.
And then this is here on the horn so it doesn't have neck dive. And I put high output humbuckers on.
Yeah.
This, because I basically built it myself. I played it all the time. And now I've stopped. I'm actually keeping it aside so I don't overplay it. I'm now becoming a little bit like,
protective of it. Yeah.
And it's fuck all. I mean, it's nothing. It doesn't have any worth to anybody but me. And I think, and it also sounds really good. It's got a really nice kind of deep tone, exactly the kind of tone I'm after. But I hardly play it because I don't want to waste it. It's the weirdest thing. But I think the reason I brought it out is because once you're finished with that thing, and you're proud of it, and you're happy with it, you're gonna be writing another 10 songs after that.
Yeah, but the funny thing is that if say, again, I mean, I got a screaming deal on that because it was in such bad condition. But had it been like, let's say it was vintage, I mean, there's no way, even in the condition I got it, I would have ever been able to afford something like, if it was like, I mean, a 50s Les Paul, forget it. Even a 60s Les Paul, pretty much forget it. Even 70s Les Paul these days, someone would have charged me like $2.5 grand for a Les Paul with no pickups in it, So,
but you're paying for the headstock.
Yeah, but let's say it was like 50s or 60s. It's like I wouldn't ever have done the project myself, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm not a luthier. I'm just some amateur hack who just likes to play with guitars.
Yeah.
But so it's like the idea of just spraying it with this stuff. It's like you can't do that to an actual vintage guitar. You have to go to like some professional outfit and have them give it like a makeover and pay thousands to have them do it. But as it is, it's like I'm not going to say how much I paid for the guitar exactly, but it was a very, very small amount for an actual Gibson Les Paul standard, and it's cost me not a lot of money to get it back up and working. I think the most money I spent on it was I got a wiring loom from Monty's Guitars, which actually cost more than the pickups. But there you go. I mean, vintage stuff. It's like the pickups. I deliberately went for 59 PAF for a set of 59 PAF clones from Creamery. Not just because they were cheap. I mean, I got them cheaply, but because it just seemed the thing to do, to bang some 59 pickups in it. It's that sort of thing. I don't know. I couldn't really explain to you why it had to be that instead of
I would have
some DiMarzio modern thing or whatever.
no, I
It's
would have
like,
put Fishmans on it. I honestly would have,
yeah,
and I would have switched
yeah, well,
between the modern and vintage style.
yeah, yeah. It's definitely one way to go. I mean, that's the thing. You could absolutely bang some EMGs in there or something like that, and it'd be perfectly legitimate. There's no reason not to do that if that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
So I guess it's just, a lot of it, I suppose, does come down to sort of taste and aesthetics. It's not like I'm trying to make it into some vintage style Les Paul, because it really isn't that. It is definitely like a sort of a 90s 2000s Les Paul. Like it came with like the kidney bean Grovers on it, and I'm not going to change those out for the vintage plastic Keystones or anything and that kind of thing. But I don't know. I just kind of wanted to get that sort of that kind of that PAF sound, that sort of mid-rangey type thing. Yeah, I don't know. So I guess, yeah, it's a tough one because I like to be um I like to be logical about all the decisions I make, but at the same time, so much of this stuff is so informed by like how I feel about things. Um, you know, and because of that, it's like it's just it's kind of hard to come down on one side or the other of the argument.
Well, I think Glenn Fricker has it right in that whole sense. Like, look, Gibsons are on par with Harley Bentons nowadays from a quality point of view. There's no argument.
Yeah,
The one
that's
is
fair. Yeah.
£300, the other one is £5,000. But there is a big but, and that is that if you are just somebody who noodles in his house and he loves the gear and messes around with it, that is a different story. But if you want to create music, the game changes. Then you should be able to, and you can use whatever you want. However, if that Les Paul inspires you 10 times more than the Holly Benton, then you should probably get the Gibson.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think I always will be that guy who wouldn't have Squire on the headstock. I've owned some Squires, and it's like the bass I use for recording with is one of those. It's a jazz bass, but it's one of those Sire jazz basses.
Yeah.
But it's like if I was gonna play bass in a band, and I had to play a jazz bass, it would have to be a Fender jazz bass. It's that kind of thing.
No, that is as much as it pains me to say this, because I try my utmost in my whole life not to be like this, but I absolutely hate the Holly Benton logo on the headstock, even though I love the guitar. I do not want to be seen with it. Not because I'm embarrassed that I'm playing Holly Benton and not a Gibson, or that I'm, but because that specific brand, I just hate the name so much, right? I've got
Yeah.
this is my always recording guitar. This is a vintage. I love this thing.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem
Yeah.
being seen with this. I play live with this. But
Yeah.
there's something about that Harley Benton goddamn name which just kills me. And so it's not necessarily I need to have a brand on my guitar, but there are some brands I don't want to be seen with.
Well, I think we can definitely say that no one's ever gonna consider a Harley Benton guitar to be vintage.
Well, if they keep knocking out the quality that they are at the moment, at least, you never know what can happen in the future.
Well, yeah, I think there's probably, in terms of what is vintage. I mean, do you think like do you think any of what's like referred to as vintage now was also kind of mass produced? I suppose there's an argument to say like old Fenders were mass produced, really, weren't they?
Yeah. Princeton amps,
And
all those things that people now kind of go to, I think were all you could consider for the day at least a mass-produced up.
Yeah,
Um, this is one thing that I don't want to miss out on this chat, and that is one more point. I know we can go on for this for hours, but
yeah.
is there any gear, any vintage gear we would like to own?
Well, that's yeah. I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, when you're a gearhead, I guess the simple answer is all of it, really, right? I would say, okay, it probably easier to list the vintage gear that I wouldn't want to own. And amongst that stuff would be like a 59 burst, right? Because that's again probably we're talking. I mean, people refer to that as like the holy grail, right? It's the more vintage than vintage. But to me, it's like first of all, there's the expense. Um, I don't think I could ever justify spending that. I mean, they're actually, when you look at sort of like the real golden age vintage Gibsons and Fenders and Gretschers and whatnot. Maybe Gretschers less so, but there still are a few that are insane amounts of money. I don't think I could. I mean, I don't think I could ever see myself spending. Maybe if I was like a super rich professional musician, but I don't ever think I'll be one. I mean, 25 grand on one guitar. When you think about what you could do with 25 grand, and then, a 50s Les Paul is gonna be at least 10 times that amount. So, as much as it would be nice to play one, just to be able to say that I've done it, I don't think I'd ever want to own one of those. And then there's the aspect of like, because it's not, you don't buy it like you buy a guitar now and then it just sits in your house and it's fine. It's like you have to do stuff, don't you? When you've got like vintage guitars, you have to look after it. You have to, you have to have a guy who's the guy who like changes the frets and sources all the correct parts, and and you have to have advice on what's going to affect its value and all that kind of stuff. So it seems like a lot of vintage guitar ownership is probably a way bigger headache than you'd necessarily want. And again, I think what I aspire to owning, because for me it is principally an aesthetic thing without necessarily needing to be part of the history. I aspire to owning the custom shop recreations of the vintage gear. What I'd really like to own is a Murphy aged 1957 gold top. That's I think that's my guitar. And I think it's like you could probably pick one up used for about 4 grand. And I think that's about as much as I'd ever spend on one guitar.
That sounds very sensible, actually.
Because if someone steals it, right, it's not the end of the world. If it goes in a house fire, it's like, oh well, it's 4 grand. If I have to insure it, I can afford to insure a 4,000 pound guitar. So it's not real. And I could take it out and play it, and I could use it every day. And if I have to refret it, I'll get it refretted and not cry about it. So it's like, but then it's also like, by that standard, a very good guitar, and it looks exactly the way I want it to look because it's been made to look exactly like that old guitar. And to me, it's like, probably because I've never played a real one, it won't be any different. I think if I'd played a bunch of real ones, then I might feel differently about it, but I don't know any better. So to me, that's like, it's a guitar I could use, and that is as close to that thing as you can get without, And then there's probably a bunch of vintage amps that, I'd like to own as well. I mean, we talked about like a Vox AC30, like, I have played a 64 Vox AC30, and it wasn't working very well, but it still sounded just... there's something about the EL84 sound that's like, I don't know, it just really sounds just really musical to me,
It's the one amp that you really don't want to put any pedals in front of.
It's possible, yeah. I don't think I did at the time. Well, I mean, it definitely doesn't have an effects loop, but I don't even think the modern ones have. Yeah, it's kind of its own thing, isn't it? It's like maybe like an EP boost or something. But even then, it was a really nice sounding amplifier. It wouldn't be like the one amplifier I use for everything all the time, but it would just be like a really nice because I just plugged it. What even was it? It might have been a Telecaster. Just plugged it into it and played it, and it just everything I played through it just sounded like
Yeah.
just really good.
Yeah. I since you came up with these topics, I've been thinking about what vintage gear would I actually want.
Yeah.
And I'm a bit like you. I would rather have something old but built new.
Yeah.
So I kind of like the Friedmans because they're basically like a good modern spin on an 800, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. Hot
Okay.
rodded. Yeah.
I would, and I think the more I thought about it, the more I thought I'd rather have old, not vintage, but kind of a certain amount of analog recording gear, like a good SSL desk or a Neve desk,
Oh well. Yeah. Okay.
something
Yeah.
like
Yeah. See.
that, something that
Yeah.
has that really does impose a certain character on some of the things that you do. Um, the other thing
Yeah.
that
But
if
like
I
a bunch of preamps or something, right? Yeah. Yeah.
no, the whole thing, because
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
whole chain of rails and power rails that work together to create that sound. That's why it's a bit of a misnomer for all these plugins that create a Neve sound or something, because they don't impart it the way that it is actually imparted. They
Yeah.
recreate it on
Yeah.
one. You have to. It has to be a whole thing.
You have to have a whole thing, yeah, and it sums in a way, doesn't it?
It's the
Like a
summing
certain,
that really does it.
yeah.
The I would, for example, would love to go to a master luthier and have this thing copied with jumbo steel frets, with a slight volute, slightly thinner body, just a few tweaks that I want.
Uh-huh.
Better access. So I don't really think that there's anything vintage that I would want from gear. Maybe a I don't know. Maybe an old Mesa Boogie, a rectifier, dual rectifier, maybe. I don't know, man. I don't think there's much else vintage gear wise that I'm would pine for. Not even
Do you feel
microphones.
like, well, I have microphones, yeah, I mean, okay, so a U47, a real one.
A real
They're
one.
what, like 10 grand or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, an Elam. Um, yeah. Do you feel like, so do you feel, when you're recording, when you're writing your music and stuff like that, do you feel like, do you ever feel like, okay, actually, sorry, let me rephrase this question because you're a pedal builder, right? So mainly around that, but also, factoring in like the music that you write and record. Do you feel like the do you ever feel like you take the idea of something, of making things sound vintage or old, into consideration when you're either designing a pedal or writing music, recording music, that kind of thing?
No, I chase when it comes to tone in general. I chase shit that's in my head that stayed with me since the first Silverchair album, In Utero, some of the kind of mid 90s recordings. I chase that really saturated but rich character guitar tone that they somehow conjured up in those days. I mean, I'm not saying there's not good guitar tone now, and since about the last 5 years, I've really listened to a lot of stoner and doom stuff, and I really like those sounds. So now I'm kind of, they're kind of coming together. I like a tight but really low bottom end. I like most of the grit and harmonics and distortion to be in the lower mids. I don't like fizz at the top. These things are always in my head when I am trying to do stuff, whether it be setting up my VST or dialing in the amp or building the pedal and the kind of distortion I wanted to create. Like, for example, the Torquemore is not a lot of distortion. It's actually more of an overdrive, but it sounds like a distortion because it's got so much overtones stuff on it. And that was one of the considerations, because when you record and you want a good distortion sound, you shouldn't have too much distortion. You shouldn't oversaturate.
Yeah.
So having this really oversaturated tone, but actually not having that much distortion, I was kind of like going for that sort of thing. Like on its own, in a mix, it sounds as if you've got this huge distortion going on, but actually there isn't. So to me, these things are always in my head. It's like I'm chasing something that is sitting there, wants to come out, and sometimes I can't put my finger on it. It's like, it's easy to say you know it when you hear it, but it's kind of like that. You are looking for that grit in certain places in the tone. And I hate it when people, we always call it tone, but it's not tone, it's timbre. It's like, the tone is your texture, your tone shape. It's the timbre, the texture of that distortion that's happening. That's always in my head, and that's also why I like the analog recording gear. Now, I'm not talking about the mixing and stuff like that, but to impose a certain pleasing saturated dirt into something that is really pleasing to the ear is something that I don't want to say is missing, because recordings nowadays sound great, but it does help with the ear fatigue. It helps with I don't know, there's certain things I can't put words to it, because it's like every now and then we put ABBA on, right? As you do.
Yeah.
And you crank the fucking shit out of it, right? I don't really like ABBA, but what I love is listening to them, because their recordings are so good. If you really listen to the ABBA's recordings from the late 70s, how many instruments there are and how layered they are, yet how rich and textured and how clear everything is. It's, in my opinion, recording masterclass, right? And so, and that's something that should be more possible now because of the advancement in recording gear and digital technology and all that. But actually, our recordings nowadays don't have that. Is there a word for it? There's a real fullness to it without being in your face. It's hard to explain for me, and that's also why I still like the kind of 90s, because I think in the 90s the rock stuff that came out then, especially a lot of the grunge stuff, was really nicely produced, was so well balanced, and had such a good overall balanced tone to it. So yeah, I have these things in my head when I'm thinking of doing. That's also the DMB had the same idea. It was like, how do you really oversaturate a high gain amp or high gain pedal, so that when you play your rhythm, you're not over distorting. You've got a nice, good, clear distortion sound, nice and rich, because the moment you go too far, it goes flubby. But when you then need to really push it, and you want to clear up the bottom end, you want to chug, or you want to lead, everybody uses a tube screamer for that. And so you kind of can really argue, it's like so much, and the tube screamer really puts a very specific tone into your distortion sound, in my opinion, and to my ears anyway. So there must be something better. That's why a lot of people use clones, a lot of people use different things to boost high gain amps. So that's why what I wanted to do with the DMB was you retain everything. You don't have like this this scoop down to the low end, but you actually have more of
Yeah.
a cutoff where, you know, up to about 100, where you say, fuck the rest, we don't need that anymore. But you still keep the harmonics in the bottom end. You know, you don't have the slope and this nasal kind of weird mids in there. And that's why I was going to send you one, because I think that you know, when I listen to that stuff you did with the band, it might come in real handy with like a Mesa Boogie or something. So
Yeah, it's something that it's definitely something that everything you're saying is like right in my wheelhouse in terms of um you know what I look for in terms of sounds. And I found that same issue, you know, with sort of driving an already distorted amplifier. Even if I've got like a really good sounding amplifier, I find that if I put a pedal in front of it, like if it's a tube screamer, it becomes too nasal. It has this nasal thing. It kind of, you
yeah,
lose a lot of the low end, and then you kind of have that honky thing. Or like I found that, so I have this clone, and I don't know how close it is to an actual clone or how good it is or whatever, but what that does is it makes everything go a little bit fizzy. Um, because I think what that's really doing is sort of, it's probably more of a sort of a clean boost, so it doesn't actually make much of a choice in terms of the frequencies, but it feels like a kind of a loudness thing. So I get a bit more bass and way too much treble, and the mid range kind of disappears a little bit, so that's no good either. So you know what I really want is that kind of thing where I get more, but without more of the kind of the distortion characteristics that you get with that kind of top end fizziness, or sort of
yeah.
the where the low end gets flubby or anything like that. Um, I think probably my favorite distortion sound is like a. It's actually, you know, I really like the an older DSL 100s. You know, the JCM 2000s that came out in like the 90s. I really think that like sort of mid-range gain on that, probably like red channel 1, and then you just push that up to probably just right before like noon. Um, and that tone with a, just put a guitar with humbuckers into that, and it's like, do anything with that. It's like that single channel amp territory for me. Take everything else away from that amp, and you can just use that sound because you roll off your volume, cleans up beautifully. But then if you goose it with a good pedal in the front end of it, it's like, then all of a sudden it saturates and you get into like that, you know, singing kind of sustained territory. That's, you know, I really like that sound.
Yeah. The the I think another reason why I think that a lot of the tones get so honky is because people just tune too low. They, you know, it to me, I think the lowest is probably B. B,
Yeah.
and after B, things get too difficult to manage, to keep certain frequencies alive. Both your amp is not really designed to run them, and pedals, most distortion pedals, traditional distortion pedals, cut off frequencies way before that. So a lot of
Yeah.
those tones that you actually get in the bottom end from pedals there, unless they're designed for low tunings, are fake harmonics that come from other places. They are not the actual original signal coming through. So, but I also don't think that. I think that's also where a lot of the honkiness comes from, because when you drop all that, all you have left is that nasal tone that comes through. And if you go back now with a good distortion and you play drop D, just drop D, so just standard tuning or drop D, and you
Yeah.
realize actually how heavy it can sound, because it's not the low tuning that in my opinion and in my experience, it's not the low tuning that makes things sound heavy. It is the distortion character that makes something sound heavy.
Yeah. I agree with that.
If you take, Sabbath, they sound fucking heavy, and
Yes.
they didn't tune to A or B.
Yeah.
They were C at tops.
Yeah.
And it
I
is,
guess a lot of that also comes back to like what you were talking about with like the the fullness of those old recordings as well, because there's not a lot going on there either, is there? Really, and it's like it sounds absolutely gigantic.
that's the other thing. I thought from a recording point of view, if you get the right distortion character, if you get the right tone, you shouldn't be double tracking either. You should just have left and right. You shouldn't double track.
Yeah.
Because
Well, I have all these bad, I have all these bad habits.
no, double tracking has its place. If you're playing certain metal styles in the rhythm sections and so on, you can really build that oomph up.
Yeah.
But I suppose it needs to be thought through where you are going to be using it. I one of the reasons, I'm going to be totally honest, like a lot of the pieces where there's fast playing that I should be double tracking, I don't, because my playing is not tight enough, so it just becomes muddy.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
So trying to be so precise with certain pieces so that you can double track them and they sound spot on. Fuck. That's
Yeah,
my
I think
inadequacies.
I think when I started recording, and like when I started recording like metal stuff at first, I think honestly, I think I wasn't even really thinking about it. And it's not, we're talking again with the 90s, so it's not like there was a lot of information available on how to do it or different ways you can do it. So really, it was just like I just emulated, I guess, starting with like the Black Album and then most other sort of 90s metal, where it was sort of, especially if you got into that kind of generic new metal style metal, it was very much like a by the numbers, where it's like your rhythm part was like you had a left and right distorted guitar doing basically the same thing, and then you had a lead guitar down the middle, and that was it. That was basically your guitar layout, and I've sort of been doing that ever since.
Oh yeah, me too.
um yeah.
But
And I really I do want to get away from it, but I find that I only ever get away from it when I'm recording stuff that isn't metal. That's when I really get creative, because it's, in a way, I find that stuff easier to produce, because then it's not so much about creating this big aggressive dynamic
yeah,
uh, that you're trying to do, like by balancing the drums, and then you have to have this huge bass, and then you have to have these massive guitars. I often describe like, I think like mixing heavy metal is like trying to stuff a rhino into a suitcase, because there's so much going on and you have to fit it all into this bandwidth, and it's like it just doesn't all want to go,
well that's
and I
kind
think
of
it's so much easier.
that's kind of why you kind of forced, your hand is really forced, that if you do like really fast heavy stuff, your hand is forced to do side chaining a lot on the bass,
Yeah.
on a lot of the bass stuff, because otherwise you're not going to get away. The frequencies are just going to like build up. But
Yeah.
here's a this was a revelation to me, because I'm exactly like you, like nearly everything I've done all the rhythm things, usually double tracked, put some lead in the middle with a bit of a stereo sweep, some delay, what
Yeah.
and kept
Yeah.
it simple like that. It always works, it always sounds just fine. But I got into Opeth last year by pure chance. I didn't even really know them very well. They have the live concert at Red Rocks. I think it's called something of Titans.
Yeah.
You need to listen to that, the first two songs on a good stereo, and just be blown away. Because I mean, it's a prog band. They've got synths. They've got three singers. They've got guitar and bass, and everything is going on. And I didn't realize it until I listened to it properly on headphones, that the guitar so everything that's happening is recorded live, and the guitars are recorded left and right. So when one guy's playing rhythm and the other guy's playing lead, the lead's in the left and the rhythm is in the right.
Yeah.
And it actually sounds amazing. It was like, why don't we do this? So this album that we're doing now, toying with the idea of not being so standard in the recording, but actually doing that, playing rhythm, and if the lead comes in, it stays on its side, and kind of like as if it was recorded live. You see how it goes.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't listen to that and go, oh, that's not full enough. It just sounds amazing.
Yeah. That's always the issue, isn't it? I mean, it's like, I guess if you listen to I mean, well, you've heard my record, and it's like that's so many issues I had with mixing that, precisely because really there's too much going on in a lot of places.
Yeah.
If it goes into a lead, then you feel like the lead part's too quiet, but then you don't want to turn it up too much because then it just gets way too proud.
Yeah.
So then you experiment with taking out some of the rhythm guitars, but then they don't sound punchy enough when compared to the rest of the track.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's all, yeah.
That's why you can't get away from side chaining and automating, especially automating a lot of the graphic equalizer settings. So that, for example, if you want to keep that rhythm going at a certain level and you want the lead to stand out, you got to cut half the bottom of the lead off, for example. You gotta make these choices. But here's a different way of thinking about it. Part of the reason we do what we do, everything that we've just said, and why we record it that way, is because we've been listening to internet forums and YouTube videos for the last 15 years.
Yep.
Now, it doesn't mean that advice isn't sound and it's not usable or that it's wrong. It just means that you don't necessarily have to do it. You can just try something completely different. Because I really feel that the biggest problem that we face currently when it comes to what we think of vintage gear, to what music we listen to, what pedals we buy, and how we set up our pedal boards, and what patch cables we use, every motherfucking thing, is because if we don't do it this way and we post a picture of it on Instagram, some asshole is going to say, you should have done it that way.
Yeah.
Instead of just going like, so what? I did it this way. You can do it that way if you like. I mean, the guys that we look up to from the past, from the vintage era, we have to remember that those guys, everything they did and knew, they kind of figured it out amongst themselves.
I think that's why I like Les Paul so much. I mean, as in the guitars, but like, I didn't like Les Paul's music because I'm not really into that kind of jazz, but he basically, I mean, he invented so much stuff. He was a a real kind of pioneer of that kind of stuff. And I maybe he didn't come up with everything that's been attributed to him, but certainly he contributed to a lot of it, like multi-track recording and all that kind of stuff. And so I think I like him as a person. He's kind of like the Nikola Tesla of electric guitar, So I think that's what I find inspiring, and that's what frustrates me. And I think I completely agree with what you're saying, because I often get frustrated with myself for kind of doing stuff too much on like an assembly line. It's like, cut the drums, left guitar, right guitar, and then bass, and then do the vocals, and then solo at the end, exactly like Metallica did on Black Album, and just do everything kind of like that, rather than kind of stopping and thinking, why don't I try and get creative with this and actually find some new sounds, or just try a different part there, or just maybe leave that part on its own, or that kind of thing. And I it's not that I just never try it, and it's because when I'm in the middle of doing it, I just I just always go to what's expeditive, what I know will work, as opposed to trying to get creative with it. And it's like, it's frustrating because I know that that's such an important part of the creative process, but I never really exploit it to its full potential, you know?
Honestly, I think that also has a lot to do with the fact that we do so much in our own heads, by ourselves, in our own little space. You know, it's
Yeah.
having had these guys and jamming stuff out and recording the drums and all that has been such a godsend, because all the stuff I've done up till now is all just me, and you notice the difference. It's different. It feels better. It's more fun to play. It's very different from what we used to do, although it's the same genre stuff. But one of the things that I've also felt makes a massive difference, and I learned this a long time ago, was not to do drums, bass, and guitar, but to do drums, guitar, and bass.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that is so good is because, to me, I actually find bass and drums the most important part of, especially the stuff that we're wanting to do. And if you want the bass to be smarter in what they play and how they interact with everything, it's better for them to make those changes afterwards. So by them basically understanding what the guitar is doing and complementing or driving it, or all that sort of stuff. So
Yeah,
having
that's Paul McCartney, isn't it? He always said he records the bass last. That way he can come in and do a properly interesting bass line, as opposed to just doing something that's going to support the guitars, kind of thing.
I don't know where I got it from. I think that it was from a forum years ago, but it does make a lot of sense to me, because I find the bass can be so interesting and so powerful, even if it's just buried there. It creates all different tones and things, and it doesn't mean it's like, I think the problem comes from this idea that the drums and bass are like this unit, and then everything else is. But the bass can easily be a unit with the drums and still be musical at the same time. There's no reason it can't, and I don't think that it hinders the bassist from doing something with the drummer just because he's also taking into account, or more into account, what the what the guitar's doing or the synths are doing or whatever.
Yeah. I was like the bass lines on Faith No More records, but I think it's the bass player who actually produces them. So it's going to be more interesting and more present because of that, isn't it? But it's like, yeah, no, I completely agree. Again, I think as much as I love the idea of like a tight rhythm section, which I think is super important, especially for like rock music. I think there has to be an aspect of like pocket, like locked in, for like to really to really kind of communicate the beat. At the same time, I think there's lots of room that in heavy metal, again, I guess you tend to think of the bass as just occupying the space between the guitars and the drums kind of thing. But it's like, I think it's another one of those things. I mean, it's what one of the biggest bands to come out of the 90s is the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and it's like that's and then Primus, obviously.
Yeah.
you know
But there's also an ego issue, like, because we play guitar mainly, you kind of
yeah
focus on guitar, and just to willingly step back and say, well, um, let the bass do a lot of the heavy lifting too.
yeah
Um, it's sometimes difficult.
yeah what have you heard a band called Carnival?
I've heard of them. I don't think I've ever really listened to them.
You should check them out, because so what we're talking about in terms of like production, in terms of not having like just a left and right guitar doing the same thing, so that they're I suppose traditional 5 piece, two guitarists, bass, drums, and then a singer. um but their two guitarists are always doing different things, and it's like they're like a prog metal band, but they're very accessible. They have really great choruses and that kind of stuff. The bass is like it's it's really kind of it's its own thing. It's doing its own thing all the time, and it's like, um, eh, I mean, you'd have to listen to it to really kind of get what I mean. But they're there's such a they have this great record called Sound Awake, and really throughout the record, it's like the bass is always kind of evolving and changing and really doing interesting melodic things, but playing with sounds and different rhythms as well. There's lots of polyrhythms going on and all that kind of stuff. But you know, there's creative use of distortion. You know, not just to beef up guitar lines or whatever, but like the amazing interaction between rhythm and melody, and independently almost always of what the guitars are doing. So it's not just there as a support role. It is like very much an instrument that's just as important as whatever the guitars are doing at any given time. They're a really smart band. They're from Australia. I'm actually seeing them in February. They're coming over, but they're an absolutely fantastic band. I highly recommend that record. It's absolutely fantastic. It sounds great. I mean, the production on the record is phenomenal. Really, really good. But yeah, I kind of aspire to be more like them because they have that kind of freedom in really developing different kind of um, textures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that I suppose that's another thing with we were supposed to be talking about vintage stuff, but um, it does remind me. It's like the the internet kind of bubble, YouTube and forum bubble has not just created the vintage 30 double tracking, um, what tube screamer in front of a high gain amp problems. It's also created, I think, a lot of what genre you should be playing to be seen as heavy and cool.
Yeah.
So going back to, I think what we agree on is that the the biggest problem that we have is that it's become such a community that people are making music and riffs and play guitars to fit in with what everybody else is doing rather than making music for, dare I say, the masses.
Yeah.
And so the way you're explaining Carnival is like, well, they obviously didn't listen to the internet. They just went and did their damn thing.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah. It's prog, but not the way we think of prog now, where it's all about like it's not performative. It is all about the songs. The songs are like, a layman can listen to them and go like, I mean, maybe not, your average punter or whatever. You kind of have to already be into sort of, alternative metal, but but it's way more about the musicality and the yeah, the songs than it is about. I don't think any. I mean, the drummer is very very technical, but
Yeah.
other than that, I don't think anything like any of the other music. There's no extended guitar solos. There's nothing like that. I don't think there are any guitar solos at all to speak of. It's all very kind of it's all just melodic kind of phrases and stuff like that. It's just really really interesting. It's a little bit like Porcupine Tree, um, but sort of a little bit heavier and more Australian sounding, if you know what I mean.
I mean, with kazoos.
Yeah, that's it. No, well, they might have a kazoo on there for all I know. But it's a really great record. You should check it out.
Well, I'm actually really looking forward to Peter's suggestion of talking about writing.
Yeah,
That'll be interesting.
definitely. Well, I need to kind of I don't know many people who write music, and that sounds like a weird thing to say, but it's like because I've always fronted bands and written all the material for those bands, and I don't collaborate with a tremendous amount of other musicians. In fact, very, very rarely. I don't have a tremendous amount of experience of other people's methods of getting their ideas down. Do you know what I mean? And so I've forged my own, and exactly like you said earlier, like I'm just always like in my own head, doing my own thing and trying to evolve from there without really having the chance to talk to other people about like what their methods are and how they approach their stuff, you know?
Well, I really like the idea of collaborating with more people, but the problem is I don't really want to collaborate over the internet. I'd rather collaborate with somebody in a jam room, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I think that's my problem. I think I'm kind of fed up now with just recording riffs on Reaper, and I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Putting a bunch of riffs together and sending them out, going do something with that, and then someone else kind of Legos it together with something else, and it's like,
I mean, that's a cool experiment. It's not like that's not really what I was trying to mean, but like, I want to. It's so nice just to jam again. I mean, before lockdown, the studio that I had was closed, and it meant I had to evacuate that, and then COVID hit, and so this year we've been jamming again, and it's just been so much more fun playing with people, even though you don't feel like you're in so much control. Like you're not always 100% happy with what everybody's doing, but you just
yeah.
like that's how it is. I mean, they're probably not happy with what you're doing either. So
Yeah. I don't know. I have a kind of a control freak thing going on. I also find that I've found it like maybe over the past sort of increasingly over the past 15, 20 years, I found it increasingly hard to get together with a bunch of guys who know like who know how to play like a bunch of songs that you can just play together. Do you know what I mean? It's like if you have all tastes in common or whatever, it's like I always find it strange that there are a lot of guys that I've played with who are in bands and their influences might be the same as you, but it's like they have no idea how to play their favorite songs. Do you know what I'm saying? I think that's kind of because I learned by playing to my favorite records.
I didn't.
Yeah.
I'm one of
No?
those people. If I want to learn how to play a song, I need to go and learn it. I don't know a lot of songs. And one of the reasons was that the whole reason that I even started playing guitar had nothing to do with wanting to be in a band, had nothing to do with wanting to be a rock star, had nothing to do with any of that. It had to do purely with I was listening to certain things and I really loved
Yeah.
the guitar tone and I loved the riffs, but I thought, well, what if they just did that? Just maybe this little thing in the riff. That would sound so cool. That's literally why I started playing guitar.
All right. Is that why you make pedals as well? So you can put your spin on things.
No, the pedal making is a bit of a so I'm kind of single dad at the moment. Have been for the last 2 years, so I find it difficult to work full time. Kids are still young, and so
Yeah.
I needed to find something um, to try and make some extra money. And I have tried the pedal thing before because it's always kind of interested me. So I've built a couple of things. I'm not super smart. I just know what I know right now. I'm not some genius or anything. But
I think
I
that's all of us.
absolutely, the more I've done it, the more I just absolutely love it because I studied graphic design. I've always wanted to work more with my hands. I don't like sitting behind a computer. I like the whole aesthetic of the small bits, the enclosure, the fact that you can then use it in one of my favorite things to do, which is play guitar. It's just everything about it is just right up my alley. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's every aspect of it is something I like to do.
Yeah.
Trying to find, what the thing's going to sound like, the design of the enclosure, fiddling with small bits, fiddling with bigger bits. Every aspect of it is kind of like, what have I been doing with all my life? I should have been doing this since I was 20 or something.
Yeah. It's making, isn't it? It's making things.
That's exactly what it is. Like something out of nothing, and then somebody else takes it and enjoys it.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
so. No, with the guitar things, like I told the guys. I mean, I know how to play a few things, but another issue with playing other people's stuff is like Nowadays we always have different tunings. Like
That's true. Yeah.
it's like you
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
when are you ever in standard?
Yeah.
It's-
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. You can't play American Girl if you're in drop C sharp. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was we're kind of finished. We're kind of really happy now with the 6 songs that we're doing now. So we're kind of getting a bit bored at jam sessions. So we're like doing some of my older stuff that we used to jam and just just jamming some covers. So um, we're preparing Duality for next week. I mean, it's not difficult, but
Uh-huh.
it's a shitload of fun to play.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that one.
It's just so much fun to play. It's not hard. It is kind of tricky, but it's not hard.
It's
But
one of those things where it's quite simple, but then to get it right
that's
is
it.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
That's a great song. So have you got a guy with a baseball bat hitting a beer keg?
no, no, but
Ah, that's a shame.
yeah, I know. So no, that's literally I I I honestly didn't, and that's why I never ever like I learned all the basic stuff, and I could. I'm one of those classic people who by the time I could do 3 chords, I literally was in a band,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
learned from my 3 chords to my all my other chords while I was in the band. It was yeah, I'm not super technical. Most of it's by ear. Um, I kind of know what
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
doing.
you do
My daughter is
a lot of what
10. My daughter is 10, right? She
Yeah.
can basically read music. She plays piano like a motherfucker. She's unbelievable. And she
Yeah.
still looks up to me. She has no idea how much better she is. She's got
Yeah.
no idea. I don't tell, obviously, because her head's just going to swell the size of a.
Yeah, that's it. She's got to stay humble. A lot of what you're saying is resonating with me. It's like because I joined a band before I could play guitar at all, just because I wanted to be in a band. I was like, I joined I said I'll be the singer. I didn't know how to sing, but I was like I just wanted to be in the band, and then I started learning how to play guitar, so I could play guitar in that band. So that was the thing. But I'm not a particularly technical player either, and I think that's when we talk about this little kind of internet bubble, this YouTube bubble, and I spend quite a lot of my time watching these guys play guitar on YouTube and feeling like, why am I even doing this?
I'll tell you
And it's
why.
like,
It's very simple because I honestly feel like the majority of it is irrelevant. It is a extremely competent technical ability. That's it.
yeah,
And unless they prove the likes of me wrong by actually writing really good music that I would want to listen to again and buy, I'll stand
yeah,
by that. Now, I'm not saying they're not capable, but what we see them hash out is exactly what the boomers complain about, and I think they have a legitimate case. They are super technical, they are extremely good, they're better than most of the people that have ever existed, but are they going to make me tap my toes?
yeah,
You know?
yeah, yeah.
And I think that's the catch. So I don't know. I wish I could play that well. I'll be honest with you, but I wish I could play
Yeah, I
that
mean,
well because I would, in my head, I think, well, look how much better music I could possibly write if I was actually technically able to deliver certain things that are in my head.
I think there's two things there though, isn't there? Because it's like I wish I could play that well, but then I also know that if I applied myself, I could learn how to play that well. It's not beyond any of us to learn how to do that, but we don't, and there's got to be a reason for that. That we choose not to, and that's because I think deep down it's like, as you're saying, it's like it's kind of irrelevant because it doesn't actually, it's impressive, but it doesn't touch you in your soul
Yeah.
the way the chorus of your favorite song touches you in your soul, kind of thing.
And I'm very careful with this because I really don't want to be seem to be dissing them because I feel like the amount of work that they put into becoming that good, and their technical ability is absolutely outstanding. It's that really
And also, a lot of them write really brilliant music. I mean, we both know Rabia Masad, and it's like I think I spent a year driving to and from work listening to his band's record in my car, you know. And he's a very, very technically proficient player, but he also writes really great prog rock.
yeah,
So, yeah. But then
there are
he's one of the
exceptions. There are
yeah,
exceptions.
definitely, yeah, yeah.
You know,
I think he's amazing, but he plays with real feeling as well. You know, his playing is not just technical. It's like
but I feel he's a student. He's not a shredder.
mm.
He's got that student vibe. There's a reason why he's doing the things he does. Yeah, he's definitely the one of the top tier guys in my books for what he does.
Yeah.
The I'll be quite interested to see how people respond to what we've done now when this album is finally finished. But I think it's very different, and I like that. It's very, very different. But it's not different in the way that it's like, I don't know, Yoko Ono different. It's just
Oh, really? What a shame.
It's just there's some unusual kind of like, but I like it. We all like it, and I think that's all that matters, really, because we all know we're not gonna like sell a million albums and snort coke off whore butts on yachts. Yeah. So it's it's fine.
I think if you satisfy yourself, that's most of the battle, isn't it? You know, if you can produce something that you're proud of, then whether it works for someone else, that's just a bonus, isn't it?
Well, that's what real art is that you deliver something and you have no control if people will like it or not.
Yeah.
And that's what art should be, I think.
Yeah, oh, I agree with that. I'm always of the opinion that whatever people think about me or what I do is none of my business. And I shouldn't try and influence it. I should only do what I do as best I can. And then the thing that frustrates me is that I don't do what I do as best I can. That's the only thing I ever get frustrated with. If someone else doesn't like my shit, it's like, fine. But it's like when I feel like I've done something and I could have done it better in some kind of way, either by doing it differently or just working harder on it, then that's what really kind of drives me to do better on the next one, you know?
Yeah, I feel you, and I agree and disagree. And the reason I disagree partly is because a lot of the stuff I've done, I feel there's parts lacking. And some of those parts are because of kind of what you're saying. Is like I possibly could have worked harder. There was possibly another way I could have done it. But I also know that at the time and place when that was done, I didn't have the ability or the opportunity. And to me, personally, it was more important for it to get out than to sit on it and sit on it and sit on it and just frustrating me. So you could kind of say that I kind of was happy to rather let something go out of which I'm not 100% happy, because I, at least personally, I know what my constraints were at the time.
Yeah. But when we do talk about that with Pete.
But if I had not brought it out, it would have frustrated me 10 times more.
Yeah, that's it. Done is better than perfect. Yeah. Something like that. What is it? Art is never finished, it's only abandoned.
Abandoned, yeah. And so they're without a doubt. I mean, I could take every single thing I've ever done and redo it. But
yeah,
I suppose there's also a point at which you just have to accept something, I suppose. I don't know.
I think that's why the YouTube thing works for me as a creative exercise as well, because you can't spend 6 weeks making a video. It's like my videos, I do them in like 2 days and then done, and then they go up and I can't touch them anymore.
Yeah.
And it's like, so yeah, so you watch my first videos and they're not as good as like the videos I'm making now, and hopefully in a year's time the videos I'm making then will be way better than the videos I'm making now. But I don't try and make every single video perfect, agonize over it for weeks and weeks and weeks until I've corrected this or that or the other. It's like I I I kind of I put it together and then I sort of see all its flaws and I go, I have to live with them and just upload it and get it done and move on to the next one. And I think it's like that's something I haven't really I didn't with music. I've never really done that. With music I tend to sit on things for weeks and let them fester, until I hate them. So, but it's funny because it's like at the same time with the no matter how long I work on a piece, especially I mean if in a way like the longer I work on a piece of music, the more I'll hate it when it's done. The more I won't want to listen to it or play it or anything like that.
Yeah.
And then,
Absolutely.
but with my YouTube videos, it's like even the ones that are bad, even the ones that have like all kinds of problems with them, I'm still happy with them. I'm still, but I think I'm glad that they are the way they are. So it's a strange kind of psychology there, isn't it?
Yeah. No, I think we're in a good position where, like I said, I mean, I'm not expecting to have any meaningful success with what I do, but it has to come out, and so
Yeah.
it goes out. But anyway, you know what? It's like 10 to 12. That was nearly 3 hours. Told you.
Yeah. Yeah. No, yeah, you were not wrong. But yeah, this has been really good. I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Yeah, it's been cool. So we'll do, probably, if everybody's cool, we'll do the same next Wednesday, and hopefully Peter will be in amongst it.
That would be great.
That would be awesome. So yeah, this was cool. This was great. So yeah, I'll talk next week. Have to, promote this a little bit and see how it goes.
Yes, man.
Right. Good night, man. Take it easy.
Good night, man.